Nora Calloway was folding someone else's laundry when her phone died for the third time that week. The charger cord had frayed down to bare copper wire held together with electrical tape she'd found in the break room, and even that had finally given out. She stood at the sorting table with warm towels stacked chin-high and said nothing, because saying something would have required energy she was saving for the walk to school. The shift ended at 4. Lily got out at 3:15. The school was 6 blocks east. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had been working at Portsmouth Laundry and Linen for 11 weeks. Before that, she'd had a job cleaning rooms at the Bay Shore Inn until the manager found out she was sleeping in her car in their parking lot and let her go politely. With 1 week's pay and an apology he seemed to genuinely mean. Before that was the diner on Marsh Road. She hadn't noticed the street name until her 3rd week there, where she'd lasted 5 weeks, until Gerald Marsh himself walked in for lunch with 2 of his business associates, and she'd had to set down the coffee pot before she dropped it. She quit that night. She couldn't afford to. She did it anyway. Portsmouth, Louisiana sat on the rim of the Gulf where the land stopped arguing with the water and dissolved into marsh. It smelled like brine and diesel and the sweetness of shrimp boats coming back with full holds. A town of 11,000 people spread across flat ground, one main road running from the highway to the waterfront, a marina that had been slowly losing commercial business since the big freight operations moved their bases 50 miles west to deeper water. Nora had been born here. She'd learned to swim in Portsmouth Bay. She'd learned to read tide charts before she'd learned to write cursive. Her father, Robert Calloway, had been the kind of man this town produced occasionally and never quite appreciated: reliable, skilled, unhurried, the sort of person who showed up when he said he would and did the work and went home and never made a production out of any of it. He had been dead for 4 months and 12 days. The laundry shift ended and Nora walked the 6 blocks to Lily's school with her coat zipped to her chin and her hands in her pockets, and the particular tiredness in her bones that sleep hadn't been fixing lately. Lily was on the front steps where the after-school supervisor sat in a folding chair with a paperback. 8 years old, dark eyes, her grandfather's nose, wearing a jacket that had gotten too short in the sleeves 2 weeks ago. Nora had been meaning to find a replacement from the Goodwill on Claiborne Street. She'd been meaning to for 3 weeks. Lily saw her coming and ran the last 20 feet with the decisive sprint of a child who still believed arriving faster made things better. Nora caught her and swung her once and set her down. "You smell like dryer sheets," Lily said. "Occupational hazard." They walked back through town. Lily talked about school, a project on Louisiana wetlands, a disagreement with a classmate over whose drawing of a heron looked more like a heron, a substitute teacher who kept mangling the word Atchafalaya and pressing on with magnificent confidence. Nora listened and answered in short sentences and watched the town pass. The hardware store where her father had bought his supplies for 30 years, the owner nodding at her through the window with the particular helplessness of sympathy that couldn't do anything. The real estate office on Canal Street with Gerald Marsh's name in gold lettering on the door. The Marina Road turning left toward water. They'd been at the Bayview Motel for 6 weeks. $42 a night, which was $42 more than nothing, which was what Nora had started with when she'd given up the Baton Rouge apartment. The room had 1 bed and a bathroom and a small table where Lily did her homework and a television that got 4 channels clearly and 2 more if you held the antenna right. Nora had bought a hot plate from the hardware store and kept it by the window. Rice and beans most nights, or pasta, or eggs. Lily ate everything without complaint, which Nora understood was either a sign of good character or of a child who read the situation and had decided not to add to it. Probably both. Robert Calloway had died quietly in his sleep at 61. His heart had been failing for 2 years while he told his doctors he felt fine and told Nora he'd never been better. He was lying both times, but gently. That was how he did most things. The funeral was on a Thursday in November, low clouds sitting flat over the water, a cold that felt personal. Nora had driven down from Baton Rouge with Lily and a suitcase, expecting grief, paperwork, the administrative weight of closing out a person's life. She had not expected Gerald Marsh to be standing at the door of her father's house when she arrived with a particular expression on his face: not sorrow, not welcome. Something that looked like a calculation completing itself. Gerald Marsh had married Nora's mother, Patricia, 16 years ago. He was 53 then, a real estate man with his name on an office door and a seat on the Portsmouth Town Council, and the practiced warmth of someone who deployed charm the way other people use tools at the right moment, for the right purpose, then put it away. Nora had been 18 when they married, already most of the way out the door to her own life, and she'd told herself the weight in her chest at the wedding was just anxiety about change. She'd been wrong about that, but her mother had loved him, genuinely, and Nora had respected Patricia enough to stay her judgment. Patricia died in February 7 years ago, breast cancer, 2 years from diagnosis. Gerald cried at the graveside. Nora had watched him do it and reconsidered everything she thought she knew about him. Maybe grief was the truest version of a person. Maybe she'd been unfair. He kept the house Patricia's house, the one she'd owned before the marriage. Nora had told herself that was just how it worked legally, that her mother had known and been at peace with it. She'd been telling herself that story for 7 years. In the year after Patricia died, Nora had noticed something in her father that she couldn't name exactly, a new carefulness. Robert Calloway had always been measured, but now he was something past that, deliberate in what he said and to whom, particular about his paperwork, meticulous about keeping records. She'd asked him once if everything was okay, and he'd said yes. Everything's fine, and she'd believed him because she'd needed to. She understood now that her father had been watching Gerald Marsh for years and making preparations she hadn't been told about. He'd hired a lawyer in Homa and had a will drawn up. He'd told Nora about it in a brief phone call 3 years before his death, matter of fact and practical. House, savings, equipment to her, and the tugboat, the Margaret Rose, with a note attached. The note said, "Don't sell her without opening her first." Nora hadn't paid much attention to that last part at the time. The night of the funeral, after the guests had gone and Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, Nora went looking for the will. The study was at the back of the house, through a short hallway that always smelled like old lumber. The door was half open. The fireplace was going, which was unusual. The nights weren't cold enough for it. There was a smell in the air she didn't identify for 3 seconds, and then she did. Paper burning. Gerald was at the desk. He turned when she came in, unhurried. Through the fireplace screen, she could see the last intact corner of a document, the letterhead of a lawyer's office in Homa, the words "Last Will and Testament of Robert James Calloway," and then the orange, and then black, and then ash. She turned to face him. Gerald sat back in the chair and crossed one leg over the other with the ease of a man who had rehearsed exactly this conversation and knew how it ended. "Your father had financial obligations to me," he said. His voice was level, unhurried, almost kind. "Alone, going back several years. The house and the savings were collateral. I have documentation. If you'd like to contest anything, you're welcome to hire an attorney and pursue it through proper channels. You just burned his will. I disposed of old correspondence." He stood, smoothly. "I'd like to keep this respectful, Nora, for your father's memory. He was a good man. None of this is about anything other than a legitimate financial arrangement." He went to bed. She stood in the study with the smell of burning paper in her lungs and her hands shaking at her sides, and the full scope of it settling over her. He'd been planning this for years. The loan documentation was fabricated, she was certain of it, but proving that required the will, and the will was ash. She drove to Homa the next morning while Lily slept in the back seat. David Tran was Robert Calloway's lawyer, organized and apologetic and frightened in a way that told her something had already happened before she walked in. His filing cabinet had been broken into. The copy of the will, the only copy in his possession, was gone. A replacement folder, identical, empty, had been left in its place. The break-in had not been reported because no one had checked that cabinet since Robert Calloway's last visit 2 years ago. "Without the original or a certified copy," Tran said carefully, "contesting the estate is difficult. Months of proceedings, possibly longer. And if Gerald Marsh has documentation of a loan agreement, he fabricated it. I believe you." He said it as though it cost him something. But belief isn't evidence. Someone had known which lawyer held the backup copy. Someone had gone there in advance and removed it. The operation had been thorough and patient, and all of it had been invisible until the moment it needed to work. Nora drove back to Portsmouth and did the math that had been waiting for her. $612. A Honda Accord with failing brake pads. A storage unit with her furniture in it, and no apartment to return it to. A daughter who needed a new jacket and hadn't asked for one in 2 weeks because she'd stopped asking for things she could see Nora couldn't provide. The town of Portsmouth watched from a careful distance. People said Robert Calloway was a good man. They said it was a shame. They said it quietly and then moved on, because Gerald Marsh sat on the town council and his name was on the letterhead of half the commercial leases in town, and that kind of name had gravity in a place this size. You didn't go up against it with nothing in your hands. You acknowledged it from across the street and kept walking. 3 weeks at the Bayshore Inn on Gerald's gracious charity. Then the laundry job. Then a second job search that hadn't produced anything yet. The arc of the last 4 months traced a straight line towards something she couldn't afford to reach. What changed it was a notice tacked to a post at slip 14 of the Portsmouth Municipal Marina. She'd gone to the marina on a Tuesday morning because grief takes people to specific places and she'd needed to see the boat. She hadn't been aboard the Margaret Rose since she was 22, the summer she'd helped her father run a load of pipe fittings offshore. The boat had been freshly painted then, engine clean, her father moving around the deck with the settled ease of a man on familiar ground. Now the hull was a mottled gray-brown, rust bleeding down from the anchor winch in long vertical streaks. The wheelhouse windows were clouded with years of salt, one corner cracked and sealed with marine tape that had stopped holding. The main deck was a landscape of deferred work, old rope and stages of decay, seized winch drum, a deck box going soft at the corners, 2 empty fuel cans, a life ring in its holder on the port rail. The boat rode low on the port side, 3 or 4 inches, which meant either ballast off or water sitting somewhere it shouldn't be. Lily stood beside her studying it with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to soften her observations. It smells. Boats smell. Is it going to sink? Nora looked at the list. Not today. The notice from the Port Authority said the vessel Margaret Rose, registration LA 4471, CV, carried outstanding unpaid slip fees of $47.60. The lien had been filed. The owner of record, Robert James Calloway, deceased, had left no active estate to address the outstanding amount. The vessel would be auctioned Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Starting bid, $50. She pulled out the small notebook she used for budget tracking and did arithmetic in the margin. She had exactly $50 if she spent nothing else between now and Thursday. That meant no extras, no emergencies, no school lunch account reload she owed and hadn't paid yet. Lily hadn't mentioned that last one in a week, which Nora was choosing to interpret as patience rather than resignation. $50 for a rusted tugboat worth, by anyone's calculation, nothing. A tugboat her father had told her not to sell without opening first. She pulled the notice off the post and held it. Behind her, at the end of the dock, a pelican landed on a piling and regarded her with the magnificent indifference of a creature that had never spent one moment of its existence worrying about anything. She took the notice home. She didn't sleep well for 2 nights. The study fireplace kept coming back, the smell of it, the orange at the corner of the page, the particular steadiness in Gerald's face as he explained himself. She thought about the loan documentation he claimed to have. She thought about the lawyer's empty filing cabinet. She thought about the fact that Gerald Marsh had spent years watching her father, learning his assets, identifying his legal arrangements, and systematically removing every protection Robert Calloway had put in place. Except one. Her father hadn't mentioned the tugboat to the lawyer as a notable asset. It appeared in the will she'd seen it in the copy Tran had briefly described to her before confirming it was gone, listed plainly, along with the note about not selling before opening. But in terms of market value, in the terms that Gerald Marsh thought in, it was nothing. An old commercial tug with deferred maintenance and back fees. It wouldn't have been worth the paperwork to claim. He had taken everything else with surgical precision. He had not taken the boat. That fact lived in her head alongside her father's words and pressed against them. Thursday morning at 8:45, Nora sat in a folding chair in the marina office waiting room with $50 in cash in her front pocket. She'd separated it out the night before, 2 20s and a 10, and put it there rather than in her wallet because she wanted to feel it every time she moved. 6 other people came in and found seats. Pete Delaney from Delaney Marine Salvage, who bought and stripped vessels for parts, sat 2 chairs down and looked at the floor when he saw her. which she read as the particular discomfort of a man who'd heard about her situation and didn't know what to do with it. Kendra Wu from the town planning office was near the window with a clipboard, there in some official capacity. Two men she didn't recognize, one heavy set in a canvas jacket, one younger with his eyes on his phone, were near the door, possibly out-of-town buyers who'd seen the listing. And in the back, with a paper cup of coffee and a gray suit jacket over a blue shirt with no tie, leaning against the wall the way men do when they want to look as though they have nowhere else to be and would also prefer you not forget they're there, was Gerald Marsh. He looked at her when she came in, not with anger, not with guilt, with the practiced attention of a man confirming something he already knew. She was here. She was exactly as predictable as he'd expected, and this would end precisely as he'd planned for it to end. Then he looked at his coffee. The Port Authority officer was a man named Henderson who ran auctions with the enthusiasm of someone doing their taxes. He read the vessel description from a paper. 1971 commercial tugboat, 78 feet. As is with all contents, no warranty. Buyer assumes all fees and liens. The marine survey on file was 3 years old and should be considered advisory only given current condition. A note in the file indicated approximately $15,000 to $20,000 in deferred maintenance required to return the vessel to seaworthy status. Someone in the room made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Starting bid is $50. Do I have 50? Nora raised her hand. 50. 75? Anyone? Delaney shook his head. Not worth it for parts at that level of deterioration. The two men near the door exchanged a look and stayed still. Gerald watched his coffee cup. 50 going once. 50 going twice. The gavel came down. She signed the paperwork at the counter. Henderson slid the slip key across to her. The vessel. Documentation. The lien release printed on county paper. She's yours, he said. Gerald paused beside her on his way to the door. He didn't stop fully, just slowed. Enough? Sentimental value, he said. Not unkindly. Almost gently. She was my father's. He nodded once. The nod of a man who understood something and considered it unfortunate. 15 to 20,000 in deferred work, minimum. You'd clear 800 in scrap. Maybe less, given the list. A brief pause. Your father had a generous heart. Always had trouble knowing the difference between what mattered and what he wanted to matter. He walked out without waiting for an answer. Nora kept her eyes on the paperwork and her hands flat on the counter until the door closed. She picked up the key. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Lily was at school. The afternoon was the pale cold of a Gulf winter that never fully commits, and Nora walked down the dock in rubber boots from Goodwill, carrying a flashlight and the pry bar she'd borrowed from the laundry's maintenance closet, with her father's words running a loop through everything she was doing. Don't sell her without opening her first. Her father had not been a sentimental man about objects. He was practical in the specific way of people who've worked physically for a living. Things were tools, or they weren't. They served a purpose, or they didn't. An attaching feeling to them beyond what was useful got in the way of getting things done. When he said something, he meant it in the most literal sense available. Don't sell her without opening her first was not poetry. It was instruction. She stepped onto the gangplank. It flexed under her weight, aluminum bowing, and she moved carefully to the main deck. The list was real up close. 3 inches to port, maybe 4. She crouched near the stern and lifted the bilge access plate manual pump handle. No automatic float switch, which meant if water had been getting into a compartment, it had been sitting there undisturbed for 3 years. She'd need to pump it and check levels before she could be confident about anything structural. The deck itself told the story of a working boat that had gone still mid-sentence. Towing cleats along the stern rail, heavy iron, well-built. The winch drum seized with rust in a way that would take heat and patience to address. Rope in stages of usefulness, some of it still sound, most of it past it. The deck box in the corner had taken on moisture through a failed seam and was going soft. The lid required force to open, and inside was nothing but a rusted shackle and a spare cleat plate. The life ring in its holder on the port rail still had its line intact, which said something about the quality of the original gear, even if it said nothing good about the last 3 years of neglect. Her father had bought the Margaret Rose in 1988, the year Nora was 4, and she had been present for enough of his working life to know this deck, as well as any room she'd grown up in. The worn patches in the non-slip coating ran a clear route. Wheelhouse door to winch, winch to stern cleat, and a worn oval near the port rail where he'd stood often, looking at the water or the dock or whatever it was her father looked at when he had time to look. She went to the wheelhouse. The door was steel, corroded at the handle, and she worked it until it gave. The air inside was close and stale in the specific way of sealed spaces near salt water, not rot, not mildew, something that contained both and had been sitting long enough to become its own smell. The helm console ran most of the forward bulkhead. Compass, depth finder, a radar screen that had shown green sweeps once in another decade. VHF radio, dead. Chart table bolted to the starboard wall. Paper charts still rolled in their holders, their edges salt stiffened but intact. The captain's chair had gone to cracked vinyl with foam showing through at the seams. On the shelf above the windshield, lying face down, was a framed photograph. She picked it up and turned it over. Her parents, young late 20s, maybe younger. Her mother with her head thrown back laughing at something outside the frame, one hand on the rail, the other waving at whoever was holding the camera. Her father half turned toward the lens with an expression so completely him, that mix of amusement and mild embarrassment at being photographed, that Nora had to look away and breathe before she could look again. She set it back on the shelf, face up this time, and stood there for a moment with the flashlight lighting them both. The logbooks were in a wire rack above the chart table, 7 of them spanning decades. She pulled each one and opened it. Her father's handwriting, neat and angular, never varying much. Dates, routes, cargo descriptions, weather conditions, ETA notations, fuel logs. The record of a working life kept with the same care he brought to everything. She scanned the years 1988, 1991, 1997, the runs getting shorter in the final volumes as his back worsened and the heavy freight work went elsewhere. The final entry in the last logbook. Last run Portsmouth to Morgan City. Crew just me. Cargo 4 pallets machine parts. ETA met. Under that, with no date beneath it, the last thing he had written in any of the books. Waiting. One word. Nothing after it. She stood with the logbook in her hands in the dim wheelhouse and read that word 3 more times. Then she tucked it under her arm. Below the wheelhouse, the short ladder dropped to the crew quarters. She'd been below dozens of times as a child. Her father had taken her on the shorter runs, let her sit at the crew table and eat sandwiches while the engine ran under everything. That deep mechanical rhythm that meant the boat was working and her father was working and the world was operating as intended. The layout was in her body memory even after 12 years away. Narrow passage, 2 bunk berths port side, engine room door starboard. The crew quarters were sparse in the way of working boats, not neglected, just stripped to purpose. 2 bunks with mattresses that had gone to compressed foam and springs. A bolted-down table with 2 fixed seats. A propane burner in a marine bracket with a rack of pots above it. The pots still there, still clean, still organized. And in the forward section, built into the hull, a storage cabinet roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, with a heavy marine hasp and a padlock. The padlock was rusted. She worked the pry bar into the gap between the hasp plate and the cabinet face, applied pressure slowly, then harder, feeling the screws in the old would begin to give. The hasp was stronger than what held it, and after 2 minutes of steady work the plate pulled free with a sound like something releasing. The cabinet door swung open. 3 shelves. Top shelf. Oilskins, the heavy-duty kind you wear in bad weather, folded neatly. Middle shelf. A plastic dry box, the marine kind with a silicone gasket seal, used for documents and electronics. Bottom shelf. A large coffee can with its plastic lid pressed down, sealed, sitting heavier than any coffee can full of coffee had any right to. And beside it, lying on its side with the shoulder strap coiled under it, a leather satchel. She knew it immediately. She had known it her entire life. Her father had carried it on every run, every supply trip, every overnight haul she could remember. Dark brown leather, the kind that gets better with decades, worn smooth on the corners where his hand rested when he carried it. She'd asked him once, when she was maybe 6, what was in it. He'd said, the important things. She had accepted that answer the way children accept answers that feel complete even when they aren't. She had never asked again. She lifted it. It was heavy. She sat on the lower bunk with the satchel on the bunk beside her and the flashlight propped against the wall and the sounds of the marina coming through the hull lines creaking, water moving against the hull, somewhere farther along the dock a generator running low and steady. She worked the buckle. It was stiff, but it gave. Inside, a sealed envelope with her name on it. Her father's handwriting, the letters large and deliberate, as if he'd been thinking about each one separately. A second envelope, sealed, labeled in his capitals, Coast Guard registration and legal do not discard. A small spiral-bound notebook with a rubber band around it. And at the bottom of the satchel, wrapped in oilcloth and taped with marine tape in a tight, deliberate package, something dense and rectangular. She pressed it through the cloth. Hard. Heavier than it looked. She opened the envelope with her name on it first. 2 pages. Her father's handwriting, a little slower than his usual pace, the way a person writes when they know they won't be present to explain themselves afterward. Nora, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I'm not there to tell you in person what I should have said years ago. There are things I kept from you to protect you, and I know now that I was right to hide them, but wrong to stay quiet about them. So I'm putting it down on paper and leaving it where I hoped you'd eventually come looking. This boat is more than she looks. I know what she looks like from the outside. I left her in that condition on purpose, these last few years, because a neglected boat draws less attention than a cared-for one. The engine is sound. The hull is sound below the waterline. She can work. I kept her ready under the rust, for someone who knows where to look. What is on this boat is yours. All of it. I built it over 30 years, quietly and carefully, because I learned early that the people who want to take what you have can only take what they can see. I am sorry I hid it from you as well. That was the safest thing I knew how to do, and I made the decision without telling you, and that wasn't fair to you. There is more on the boat than what is in this satchel. Things I need you to see and understand before you make any decisions. Do not rush. Do not tell Gerald. Do not tell anyone you haven't decided to trust completely. The notebook has the locations. Read it carefully and work through them in order. You were always the clearest thinker I knew, and I am sorry I treated you like you needed protecting from information instead of giving it straight. You deserved better from me than that. Do not be alone when you open everything. Find someone who knows this town and knows boats and does not owe Gerald Marsh anything. I love you, Nora. You always were enough. Your father, Robert. She read it twice. The second time through, her hands were still. She sat in the crew quarters of a rusting tugboat she had bought for $50, in a slip at the Portsmouth Municipal Marina, in the town where she was born, with the smell of diesel and salt coming through the hull and the low creak of the boat against its lines. And she looked at the oilcloth bundle at the bottom of the satchel, and at the sealed legal envelope, and at the small spiral notebook with the rubber band around it. And she let the full weight of what her father had written settle into her. He had known. He had known what Gerald Marsh was, and he had known for long enough to build something in secret and hide it carefully and leave instructions for her to follow. He had maintained the engine and the hull while letting the topside rust and fade so the boat would look like exactly what Gerald Marsh saw when he looked at it, a liability. Something to be dismissed. Something not worth calculating into the theft. Gerald had taken the house and the savings and the truck and the tools and the photographs off the walls and the small fishing skiff and the contents of the workshop. He had taken all of it with the thoroughness of a man who had been planning the inventory for years. He had not taken the boat. Because he looked at the Margaret Rose and saw $47 in back fees, $15,000 in deferred maintenance, $800 in scrap value at best, and a sentimental attachment that would lead a grieving daughter to make an impractical decision. He had filed the boat away in the category of things not worth fighting over and turned his attention to everything else. He had been wrong. Nora put the satchel back together carefully. She put it in her tote bag along with the logbooks. She did not open the oilcloth bundle or the spiral notebook or the sealed legal envelope, because her father had told her not to be alone when she opened everything. And she was alone, and she had spent 4 months watching what happened when she acted without adequate preparation. She would not make that mistake again. She needed Clarence Webb. Clarence Webb was 71 years old and had worked the Portsmouth docks for most of his adult life, shoulder to shoulder with Robert Calloway for 25 of those years before his knees ended that chapter. He ran a small boat repair operation now from a converted shed 2 blocks from the marina. More diagnosis than heavy work, at his age, but the kind of diagnosis that came from knowing engines and hulls the way some people know their own handwriting. Not as something learned, but as something native. He was short and broad with hands that looked like they belonged to a larger man and a stillness about him that Nora associated with people who had done hard physical work for decades and had stopped needing to prove anything to anybody. He'd known Nora since she was 4. He'd come to Robert Calloway's funeral and stood in the back and said almost nothing and left before the reception. She'd seen his face when Gerald Marsh shook hands with the pastor near the door, and she had stored that expression away without fully examining it. He had a personal dislike of Gerald Marsh that predated her mother's marriage by at least a decade. She'd never been told the full story. She knew only that it existed and was settled and was not something Clarence discussed in terms that invited questions. She locked the wheelhouse. She checked the lines on the cleats, all held. The boat wasn't going anywhere tonight. She walked up the gangplank and off the dock as the sun finished going orange over the marsh, and the marina lights came up, warm and watery, casting long shapes on the water below. She picked up Lily from after-school care with 4 minutes to spare, swung her once on the school steps, accepted the full report on the heron drawing and the substitute teacher's ongoing struggle with Louisiana geography. Bought 2 orders of red beans and rice from the gas station on Claiborne because it was the cheapest hot food in town, and Lily had eaten it without a single complaint for 11 weeks. And Nora thought about that sometimes when she needed to remember something good about people. They ate at the small table by the window. The television was on low. Nora ate without tasting much of it and looked at the tote bag on the floor by the bed. Is something wrong? Lily asked. No, you're doing the thing. What thing? The face. When you're thinking about something hard. Lily touched her own forehead with one finger. Right here, this line. Nora looked at her daughter across the takeout containers. 8 years old, her grandfather's dark eyes, her grandmother's chin, some quality of attention that was entirely her own, the way she looked at you when she was actually looking, like she was considering you seriously and intended to reach a conclusion. Robert Calloway had had that. Patricia had had it. It had skipped Nora's generation, or maybe it just expressed itself differently in her. And here it was again, sitting across a motel table in an oversized school sweatshirt, waiting. I found something today, Nora said. On your grandfather's boat. Lily set her fork down. What kind of something? The kind I need to understand better before I can explain it properly. Nora looked at the tote bag. But I think it might change things for us. Lily was quiet for a moment, in the careful way of a child who has learned not to get ahead of what's actually been confirmed. Good change or bad change? Nora thought about the letter. About the oilcloth bundle, dense and rectangular, sitting at the bottom of a leather satchel that had been locked in a cabinet on a rusting boat for 3 years. About the word at the bottom of a logbook page. Waiting. About Gerald Marsh standing in the marina office watching her raise her hand for $50 and deciding she was exactly what he'd always taken her for. Sentimental, impractical, a woman following grief down a hole that wouldn't lead anywhere. Good, she said. I really think good. She would go see Clarence Webb in the morning. She would go back to the Margaret Rose with someone who knew boats and knew this town and owed Gerald Marsh nothing. And she would open the rest of what her father had left for her, in the right order, the way he'd asked. She would be patient. She would be careful. She had spent 4 months and 12 days watching everything taken from her by a man who was very good at what he did. She could afford one more night. The morning came gray and still over the marsh, the kind of Gulf morning that held its breath before deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. Nora had not slept much. She'd lain on the motel bed listening to Lily's breathing even out beside her and stared at the ceiling and ran through her father's letter in the order he'd written it. Don't be alone when you open everything. Find someone who knows this town and knows boats and does not owe Gerald Marsh anything. She'd thought about that last sentence for a long time. In a town the size of Portsmouth, owing Gerald Marsh something wasn't only financial. It was social, professional, political. He sat on the council that approved business permits. His name was on the letterhead of the commercial insurance broker most local businesses used. He knew which favors he'd done for whom and never forgot to collect. The list of people in Portsmouth who owed him nothing at all was, by Nora's careful count, short. Clarence Webb was on it. She'd been thinking about Clarence Webb's face at the funeral reception. She'd watched Gerald cross the room and put out his hand to various people: the pastor, the bank manager, 2 council members, the marina director, and she'd watched each of them take the handshake with the specific body language of people who were glad to be seen as appropriate. Then she'd watched Gerald's path carry him near Clarence, who was standing by the window with a plate of food he hadn't touched, and she'd seen Gerald alter his route by about 3 degrees. Not dramatically. Enough. The way you navigate around something without making a production of doing it. Clarence had noticed. He'd watched the redirection with an expression that said, "Yes, exactly, keep walking." Whatever was between them was old and settled and mutual. Nora dropped Lily at school with a packed lunch. The account balance problem was still unresolved, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise, walked back to the motel for the tote bag, and was at Clarence Webb's shed by 8:15. The shed sat on a narrow lot between a retired shrimper's house and a chain-link fence holding back an overgrown lot. From the street, it looked like a converted garage, corrugated metal sides, roll-up door partially raised, a painted sign above it that said Webb Marine Repair in letters that had once been red and were now a faded terracotta that somehow suited the place better than fresh paint would have. From inside came the sound of something being filed, slow and precise. Nora ducked under the roll-up door. The shed held the organized complexity of a working repair space. An engine block on a stand. 2 outboard motors in various stages of disassembly on a workbench. Tools arranged on wall-mounted pegboard with their outlines painted beneath, so everything had a designated home, a place it returned to. A stool. A space heater glowing orange in one corner. And Clarence, seated on the stool, working a flat file across a shaft, coupling with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned that rushing the file accomplished nothing. He looked up when she came in. His face did something complicated that he didn't try to hide. "Nora Calloway," he said. "Been wondering when you'd come." "You've been expecting me?" "Not expecting. Hoping." He set the file down and straightened his back slowly, the careful movement of a man managing cumulative complaints from a body that had worked hard for 7 decades. "I heard you bought the Margaret Rose. Yesterday morning." He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd been sitting with. "Your father mentioned that boat to me once." Not in detail. Robert wasn't a man for detail unless he had a reason, but he said once, maybe 3 years ago, that if anything happened to him, I should make sure you went looking on the boat. He paused. He said that, and then he said nothing else about it, and I respected that and didn't ask. But I thought about it. He left a letter, Nora said. She set the tote bag on the workbench. He said to find someone who knows boats and doesn't owe Gerald Marsh anything. Clarence made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. Well, that narrows it in a hurry. He left a satchel on the boat. Inside it, the letter, a sealed legal envelope, a small notebook, and something wrapped in oilcloth I haven't opened yet because he told me not to be alone when I did. Clarence looked at the bag, then at her. His expression was the face of a man making a decision he'd already made before she walked in. "You eat breakfast?" "No. There's coffee." He pointed at a percolator on the corner of the workbench. "Pour yourself some. Tell me what the letter said. Then we'll go." She poured into a mug that said Offshore World Fishing Tournament 1994 and told him everything. The night of the funeral. The fireplace. Gerald's explanation, delivered with the patience of a man who had rehearsed it. The lawyer in Homa with the empty filing cabinet. 12 weeks in the motel with $50 accounted for, and the auction on Thursday, and the satchel in the locked cabinet with the pry bar marks on the hasp. He listened the way her father had listened, without redirecting, without filling silences, with the full and settled attention of a man who understood that some things needed to be said in sequence before they could be understood at all. When she got to Gerald at the fireplace, his expression didn't change. When she described the empty filing cabinet, he nodded once, slowly. "How long have you known," she asked, "that he'd do something like this? That Gerald Marsh would do something like this specifically?" Clarence picked up his coffee. "Long time. Gerald and I had a situation about 12 years ago. Family named Turode, old Portsmouth family, fishing people, owned a waterfront parcel going back 3 generations. He wanted it. He started with friendliness, which is always how he starts, and when friendly didn't produce what he wanted, he started making phone calls to the county tax office, pointing out discrepancies. Then the assessed value went up 40%. Then the family's insurance company received a letter about an inspection they'd never been notified about. The policy got canceled, and Gerald appeared again, still friendly, with a cash offer that looked fair only if you didn't know what waterfront land was actually worth. He set the mug down. I went to the bank with them, helped them understand what was happening. Gerald found out. After that, he and I maintained a respectful distance that we've both honored for 12 years. He bought the land anyway. 60 cents on the dollar from people he'd maneuvered into a box. That's how he operates. Not outright theft conditions. He's patient and organized, and he understands exactly how much trouble the law will take on his behalf. The Turodes didn't have the resources to fight it. Your father did, but your father had a different problem. What problem? Clarence looked at her. You. He knew. I think he worked this out years before his health started going, that if Gerald understood how much he actually had, he'd use you as leverage. The threat didn't have to be explicit. Just the awareness that you existed and that Robert loved you more than anything else he owned. So your father did the only thing that made sense to a man who thought the way he did. He made himself look like he had less than he had, and he put the rest somewhere Gerald wouldn't think to look. A rusting tugboat. A rusting tugboat. Clarence stood from the stool with the slow deliberateness of someone whose knees required it. Let's go. At the marina, Clarence walked the dock ahead of her and stopped at the gangplank of slip 14 and stood looking at the Margaret Rose with his hands on his hips and his eyes moving across the hull in a way that was different from how she'd looked at it. She'd seen neglect and sentiment. He was reading something else entirely. Lists to port, he said. I noticed. It's not structural. Trim ballast. He pointed at the hull at the waterline, where the port side rode fractionally lower. She's carrying proper displacement for her size. The list is deliberate. Someone adjusted the ballast to sit her that way. My father. Who else has been on this boat in 3 years? Nora stood at the top of the gangplank and looked at the port side. A deliberate list. She thought about a man who maintained an engine and a hull below the waterline while letting everything above it rust and fade and accumulate the convincing appearance of neglect. Who wrote one word at the bottom of the last logbook page. Waiting. The ballast tanks, Clarence said. That's where I'd start. They went aboard. Clarence moved through the vessel differently than she had, with a diagnostic efficiency that came from decades of knowing what to look at and what it meant when he found it. He checked hull seams in the forward section, pressing his palm flat against the liner and moving it in slow arcs. He went into the engine room and spent 5 minutes inside without saying anything, then came out. Engine sound, he said. Compression's good. Injectors look recently serviced. Coolant's been changed in the last 2 years. He looked at the port exterior. Hull below the waterline, I'd want to haul her to check the keel welds. But from what I can see, the metal's clean. The blistering above the waterline is surface, not structural. He paused. Somebody maintained this boat carefully for a long time and then let everything that showed deteriorate on a controlled schedule. He wanted it to look abandoned. He wanted it to look worthless, Clarence said. Those are related, but not the same thing. An abandoned boat can still attract attention from salvagers, from the Port Authority, from people looking at dock space. A worthless boat just sits there and everyone walks past. She set the tote bag on the crew table and brought out the satchel. Clarence sat across from her. She laid out the contents in order. The letter, the sealed legal envelope, the small notebook, the oilcloth bundle. He said, read the notebook first, she said. Work through things in order. She pulled the rubber band off the spiral notebook and opened it. Her father's handwriting, neat and angular, in the practical notational shorthand of a man who wrote things he intended to act on. Order of items. Read before opening. Notebook, read fully first. Oilcloth bundle, open with Clarence or someone you trust. Handle carefully. Legal envelope for your eyes first. Then share with the person helping you. Dry box, middle shelf, crew cabinet last. It explains everything else. She turned the page. A hand-drawn diagram of the boat. Precise, with measurements notated in her father's mechanical shorthand, the outline of the hull, the main deck, the wheelhouse, the crew quarters, the engine room, all in proportion. And on the diagram, marked with small circles and numbered, locations throughout the vessel. 9 of them. Each numbered circle connected by a thin line to a notation in the margin. She read the margin notations aloud to Clarence. Compartment 1, forward bilge, starboard. Compartment 2, keel access, aft of engine mount. Compartment 3, captain's cabin, behind chart table panel. Compartment 4, starboard deck box, false floor. Compartment 5, forward berth, under bunk platform. Compartment 6, engine room, behind port exhaust housing, documents only. Compartment 7, starboard mid-bilge. Compartment 8, helm console base, wheelhouse. Compartment 9, aft cargo frame, starboard USB, backup records. 9 locations. One of them documents. The rest, unmarked except for the numbers. Clarence studied the diagram for a long moment. His face went through something she watched without being able to fully read, not surprise, she thought. Something more like the recognition of a man who had suspected something and was now seeing the shape of it confirmed and finding the shape larger than he'd expected. How long do you think he was building this? She asked. 30 years, Clarence said. Maybe more. Robert didn't talk about money. Didn't make a show of anything. Drove the same truck for 15 years. Lived on the same street his whole life. I thought that was personality. He set the diagram down. I think part of it was strategy. She handed him the notebook and picked up the oilcloth bundle. The tape was marine tape applied in overlapping layers, tight and deliberate, the way you wrap something that needs to stay protected for an unknown length of time. She worked at it with the pocket knife Clarence handed her, taking care not to cut through the cloth itself. The layers came apart methodically. Inside the cloth, a smaller layer of waterproof plastic sheeting, heat-sealed at the edges. Inside that, a cloth pouch, drawn closed with a cord. She opened the pouch. The coins were gold. 20 of them, sitting in her palm with a density that wasn't right for their size, too heavy, too warm in color, the weight distributed with a solidity that didn't match anything else that small. She turned one over. American Eagle. 1 troy ounce. The date was 15 years ago. Clarence leaned forward and looked without touching. His expression didn't move, which told her everything she needed to know about what he was doing on the inside. 20 coins, she said. That's 1 pouch, Clarence said. There are 9 compartments. She sat still for a moment with the coins in her lap. 20 coins at roughly $1,900 each at current spot price. $38,000 in a drawstring pouch, hidden in an oilcloth bundle, in a locked cabinet, on a boat she'd bought for $50. 9 compartments. Not necessarily the same amount in each, he would have varied it, built it incrementally, bought a few at a time over decades in a way that attracted no attention at any single moment. He would have bought them spread out over years, Clarence said. Coin dealers, estate sales, probably some offshore, when he was running Gulf freight ports where you could buy metal without paperwork if you knew where to look. Small amounts at intervals. Never enough at once. All the money he didn't spend, Nora said. Your father ate simple food. Drove old trucks. Fixed things himself instead of paying someone. Took no vacations that I ever saw. Clarence looked at the diagram. All of it went somewhere. Show me compartment 1, she said. He took the diagram and led her forward into the narrowing bow section where the hull curved toward the stem. The bilge access on the starboard side was a hatch she hadn't noticed during her first exploration, integrated into the hull liner, so flush it read, as structural framing rather than a door. Clarence ran his fingers along the seam, found the recessed edge, and applied even pressure at one end. The panel released. Inside, a metal box, powder-coated, sealed with a marine gasket around the lid. A padlock. She'd noticed a key on a hook in the crew cabinet yesterday, without understanding what it was for. She went back for it. The padlock opened. Inside the box, 3 pouches. Heavier than the first. She counted. 60 coins. $114,000 in metal, sitting in a forward bilge compartment of a vessel that Gerald Marsh had watched go to auction for $50 2 days ago. She sat back against the hull and held one of the pouches and let the number settle. 8 more compartments, Clarence said. They worked through the rest of the morning systematically, using the diagram as their guide and the key from the crew cabinet on each padlock they found. The compartments had been constructed with care, not welded in or permanently altered, which would have shown up on any survey, but built as removable installations fitted precisely into existing structural spaces. The work of a man who knew how to build things and had taken his time about it. Compartment 2, aft of the engine mount, 2 pouches of gold coins and a tin of silver rounds and bars in 1 and 10-ounce weights, organized by size. Compartment 3, behind the chart table panel in the wheelhouse, 3 pouches of gold plus a stack of documents rubber-banded together, which she set aside. Compartment 4, the false floor of the starboard deck box, silver rounds and sealed tubes, a quantity she didn't count yet. Compartment 5, under the bunk platform in the forward berth, 2 more pouches, gold, and a sealed tin of silver dollars that looked old enough to be collectible rather than simply commodity metal. By the time they reached compartment 5, Nora had stopped calculating in real time and started writing figures in the margin of her own notebook, leaving placeholders for amounts she'd count properly later. Clarence had gone quiet in the way of people doing mathematics they don't want to do out loud until they're sure. Compartment 6, she said. Engine room. Documents only. Behind the port exhaust housing, a recessed box in a space that looked like structural framing, she never would have found it without the diagram. Dry and cool inside. A manila envelope, thick, sealed with tape, labeled in her father's writing. Salvage claim Gulf Meridian, see legal envelope for context. She set it on the table with the growing stack. Compartments 7, 8, and 9 followed. More silver in the mid-bilge. More coins in the helm console base. And at compartment 9, zip-tied to the underside of a structural frame in the aft section, a waterproof case containing a single USB drive labeled backup all records. They stood in the crew quarters with 30 years of careful accumulation arranged across every flat surface available. The table, the bunks, the tops of the metal boxes stacked beside the cabinet. Clarence stood with his hands at his sides and looked at it without speaking for a full half-minute. Then he took out his phone, looked up the current gold spot price, and they counted. It took 40 minutes, going pouch by pouch, coin by coin for the gold, weight by weight for the silver, making notations on her legal pad in columns. Gold, 460 American Eagle 1-ounce coins across all compartments. At $1,940 per ounce, current spot, that came to $892,400. The silver rounds, bars, ingots, and the old silver dollars which Clarence photographed and researched separately, finding that 3 of the sealed tubes contained Morgan dollars from the 1880s that were numismatic rather than commodity pieces, added another $263,000 at the low end of value. More if the Morgans went to auction at collector prices. Total physical metal, $1,155,000. Rounding down, conservatively, because her father had been a conservative man. Nora wrote the number on her legal pad and underlined it once. She set the pencil down. 1.1 million, Clarence said. He said it quietly, the way you say something that requires a moment to land properly. Accumulated a few coins at a time over 30 years, she said. From a working man's income. Because he never spent anything he didn't have to. She thought about the truck he'd driven for 15 years. The house that was modest by any measure. The food he'd eaten, simple Gulf Coast cooking, nothing expensive. The vacations he'd never taken. The clothes he'd worn until they needed replacing and then bought again without upgrading. Every dollar not spent on himself going instead into this boat, into these compartments, into this patient, decades-long construction of something that no one could see. She thought about Gerald Marsh standing at the auction, watching her raise her hand for $50 with the expression of a man confirming that she was exactly as limited as he'd always believed her to be. The salvage claim, Clarence said. He picked up the manila envelope labeled Gulf Meridian. You said the legal envelope gives context. We should look at that first. Nora opened the sealed envelope her father had labeled Coast Guard registration and legal do not discard. Inside, the original vessel registration for the Margaret Rose. Standard documentation, Robert Calloway as registered owner. Behind it, clipped together with a binder clip, a series of documents that were anything but standard. A Coast Guard report dated 11 years ago. Incident category, maritime salvage claim, uncontested. The vessel named, Gulf Meridian, 340-foot bulk carrier, lost in a Gulf storm in 1987 during a run from Veracruz to New Orleans. Cargo manifest at time of loss had listed industrial equipment and structural steel. Her father had written in the margin of his copy, in pencil, underlined twice, manifest not accurate. She kept reading. His statement to the Coast Guard, filed 11 years ago after years of independent research. Interviews with surviving Gulf Meridian crew members, conducted over several years, some willing to talk, some not. Cross-referenced insurance claims filed in Mexico in 1987 and 1988. What emerged from the research was a picture of a cargo that had nothing to do with industrial equipment. The Gulf Meridian had been transporting a private art collection belonging to a Mexican industrialist named Gerardo Fuentes Vega. A collection Fuentes Vega had officially declared lost years earlier in a separate documented incident, collecting the insurance, and had in fact secretly kept and was now moving north undeclared to sell through American dealers. The collection, pre-Columbian artifacts, colonial-era paintings, and a significant quantity of 20th-century Mexican modernist work went to the seafloor in the storm before it reached its destination. Fuentes Vega, unable to declare the loss without revealing the fraud, had written it off privately. The cargo had sat undisturbed on the Gulf floor. Robert Calloway had found the wreck during a freight run in the early 2000s, using his depth finder and a set of coordinates he'd worked out through the interviews and the insurance cross-referencing. He'd photographed the exterior of the wreck and made the Coast Guard report. Under maritime salvage law, the person who located and reported an unresolved wreck could file a claim for salvage rights to the cargo. He had filed that claim 11 years ago. The claim had been acknowledged, assigned to Federal Maritime Court review. Sitting since then, unresolved, neither denied nor approved. She turned to the contested filing section. The attorney of record for the party opposing the claim had filed an objection on procedural grounds. The report had not included a proper survey. The coordinates were insufficiently precise. The cargo manifest documentation was inadequate and had requested additional review time, which had been granted, and then granted again, and then again. The case had been extending itself for 11 years on procedural objections, each one small enough to be reasonable sounding and together comprehensive enough to prevent resolution. The attorney of record for the opposing party, Marsh & Associates, Portsmouth, Louisiana. Nora set the document down on the table. Clarence had been reading over her shoulder. He straightened slowly. "He's been blocking it," she said. "Not stealing it, just keeping it stuck." "Because if the claim resolves," Clarence said, "the cargo question goes to federal court. And the cargo and undeclared collection moved in violation of international import law becomes a matter of public record. Fuentes Vega has been dead for 8 years, but his estate would face legal exposure. More than that." He paused. "The collection's current value." Nora picked up the manila envelope from compartment 6 and opened it. Survey document, completed by an independent marine archaeologist 4 years after the original Coast Guard report. The survey confirmed the wreck location and condition. The hull had partially collapsed, but the cargo hold sections remained substantially intact, the cold Gulf depth having preserved the contents better than surface conditions would have. The surveyor's conclusion, written in the careful understatement of someone producing a legal document. Cargo substantially intact and recoverable with appropriate salvage equipment. Recovery cost estimate, $3 to $4 million. Estimated market value of the collection at time of survey, between $45 and $70 million. Between $45 and $70 million. On the seafloor of the Gulf of Mexico, attached to a salvage claim filed by her father 11 years ago, contested by Gerald Marsh's firm through 11 years of procedural delay. He couldn't pursue it, Nora said. Gerald would have kept blocking every move indefinitely. Robert Calloway, private claimant. Working alone, Gerald could stall that forever. But a new owner of the vessel, Clarence understood before she finished. The claim is against Robert Calloway. If ownership of the vessel and all associated rights and interests transfers to a new registered owner, Gerald's contest was filed against my father, not against me. They sat with that for a moment. In the quiet of the crew quarters, with the smell of the Gulf coming through the hull and the stack of documents on the table between them, and $1 million+ in metal locked back in its compartments. The shape of what her father had built became finally, fully clear to her. He hadn't left her money. He hadn't left her property. He'd left her a position, a legal position, carefully constructed, that Gerald Marsh could not reach because he hadn't known to reach for it. The burning of the will had closed one door. The theft of the lawyer's file had closed another. The fabricated loan documentation had taken the house, the savings, the equipment. Every avenue Gerald had anticipated, he blocked. But he hadn't anticipated a vessel he'd watched sell at public auction for $50 because he'd calculated its value in scrap and found it wanting. He hadn't anticipated a man who'd spent 30 years being quiet and careful and patient, building something hidden in the one place Gerald's eyes never went. "There's a last piece," Nora said. She looked at the crew cabinet. The dry box on the middle shelf, last in her father's sequence, the one he'd labeled "It explains the rest." "Later," Clarence said firmly. He was looking at the porthole. "We need to copy those documents before we look at anything else. And we need to do it somewhere off this boat." She gathered the documents into the tote bag, working quickly and carefully. The physical metal she left in place, it was secure, it was hidden, and moving it without a plan for where it was going served no one. As she was clipping the last bundle, she heard footsteps on the dock. Slow, deliberate, more than one set. Clarence heard it too. He looked at the porthole, then at her. 2 knocks at the wheelhouse door, then a voice she didn't recognize, measured and professional. The specific tone of a man delivering a message that was framed as a courtesy, but wasn't one. Miss Calloway, my name's Renner. I represent Gerald Marsh. He'd like to speak with you about the property at Slip 14 when you have a moment. Nora's eyes went to Clarence. He shook his head, barely. She began putting documents back into the bag, faster now, quieter. The salvage files, the survey, the Coast Guard report, the legal envelope. Clarence moved to the opposite side of the crew space and stood still, listening through the hall. Could you come up? Renner said. His voice carried no urgency. Men like this never sounded urgent. Urgency implied you might not get what you came for. If she didn't go up, he came down. And if he came down, he saw the table and the open cabinet and the stack she hadn't yet secured. She looked at Clarence. He read it and nodded. Go up. I stay here. She climbed the companionway. The man on deck was 40-something, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that was too good for a marina dock visit and shoes that were definitively wrong for the surface. He had a pleasant, patient expression and the particular stillness of a man who did this regularly enough that it no longer required any preparation. He extended a hand. She didn't take it. Miss Calloway, I apologize for the interruption. Mr. Marsh wanted me to reach out personally because he's concerned about the condition of this vessel and the financial reality of maintaining a property of this age. A brief pause. He's offered to send a licensed marine surveyor at no cost to you, just to give you an accurate picture of what you're working with. No thank you. He also wanted me to convey that his original offer remains open. The figure can be revisited if the boat isn't for sale. Another patient nod. The kind that meant he'd expected exactly this and had already planned the next line. He asked me to mention, and I want to be clear that I'm simply conveying this. Not expressing an opinion, he asked me to mention that derelict vessels create liability exposures for new owners. Compliance timelines with the Port Authority, Coast Guard certification requirements, structural standards. Without adequate resources to address them, new owners can sometimes find themselves in a difficult position. Nora looked at him steadily. Is that a threat? It's information. He smiled, and the smile was the same as before, not adjusted, not reactive. Mr. Marsh is a thorough man. He likes to make sure people understand their options fully. I understand mine, she said. Good morning. He stepped off the gangplank without hurrying, walked back up the dock at a pace that communicated, deliberately, that no part of this conversation had gone any differently than he'd anticipated. She stood on the deck and watched him until he reached the marina building and went inside. Gerald knew she was spending time on the boat. He didn't know what she'd found not yet. If he'd known, the approach would have been different. The tone would have been different. This was still reconnaissance, still the first gentle application of pressure on someone he expected to fold under mild conditions. He was treating her as sentimental and impractical and alone, someone to be redirected before the situation needed anything firmer. 3 days, maybe fewer, before someone at the marina told him she and Clarence Webb had been aboard all morning with bags. She went back below. Clarence was at the crew table with his arms folded. What did he want? Offered a surveyor. Reiterated the purchase offer. Mentioned compliance liability. In that order. Exactly that order. Clarence unfolded his arms. He's fishing. He knows something is here, not what. He looked at the tote bag. We take everything that's leaving this boat somewhere safe today. Not the motel. Not anywhere connected to you. He paused. I have a storage unit on the east side of town. It's not in my name. It's in my sister's. She's been in Shreveport for 6 years. Gerald's never had any reason to think about her. We need a lawyer, Nora said. A federal maritime attorney. Not in Portsmouth. Not in this parish. He was already reaching for his phone. I have a name. Simone Arsenault, New Orleans. She worked Admiralty law for 20 years before she went independent. She takes salvage cases on contingency. She fronts the work in exchange for a percentage of whatever's recovered. I know her from the Turod situation. She's not someone who gets bought off, and she's not someone who backs down when the opposition has money. Nora thought about the number on her legal pad. 1.1 million in physical metal. 45 to 70 million in a salvage claim on the seafloor. One federal maritime attorney who worked on contingency, which meant Nora's current checking account balance was irrelevant. "Call her," she said. The call took 14 minutes. Simone Arsenault listened without interrupting, asked 5 questions in the precise, clipped way of a lawyer who was simultaneously listening and building a file in her head, and said she'd need to see the documents before she could commit to anything. She could be in Portsmouth by 9 the following morning. Clarence hung up. "She's coming," he said. They locked the boat and walked to Thibodeau's diner 2 blocks from the marina, not the diner on Marsh Road, not anywhere with Gerald's name on the lease. A family place, the same owner for 40 years, the coffee served in thick mugs without being asked. Clarence ordered eggs and toast and ate with the methodical efficiency of a man fueling himself for more work. Nora ordered coffee and found she was hungrier than she'd realized once the food was in front of her. Between bites, Clarence laid out the framework as he understood it. The salvage claim was federal. Gerald could slow it, but not stop it if the registered vessel owner pursued it actively and had competent maritime counsel. With the physical evidence from the boat, the documented history of the claim, and Simone Arsenault filing the new ownership registration, they could push the claim to resolution before Gerald's firm had time to add another layer of procedural delay. The key was speed and the element of surprise, and the element of surprise only held for as long as Gerald believed Nora was a sentimental woman who'd bought herself a $50 anchor and called it inheritance. "The dry box," Nora said. "My father said last in sequence, said it explains the rest. I want to know what's in it before Simone gets here tomorrow." "We go back this afternoon," Clarence said. "After we copy everything we have and put the copies in 3 different places." They split it. Clarence took the documents to his truck and drove to Shreveport Storage on the east side. Nora walked to the public library on Canal Street 2 blocks from Gerald Marsh's gold-lettered office and used the library's copier to make duplicates of the most critical items, her hands steady on the pages, the librarian at the desk paying her no more attention than she paid anyone else. She copied the salvage claim filing, the survey document, the Coast Guard report, the notations from the legal envelope. She put the copies in a large envelope and mailed it to David Tran in Homa, whose empty filing cabinet had been a lesson she did not intend to let recur, and who she trusted, in his guilt and helplessness, to protect anything she sent him. She made a second set and mailed it to the only person outside Portsmouth she knew she could trust entirely, her college roommate in Baton Rouge, who had a fireproof safe and the temperament of someone who never asked unnecessary questions. By early afternoon, she was back at the boat with Clarence. The dry box opened with the turn of its sealing lever, releasing the dry, neutral smell of a managed environment. No moisture, no salt, air that had been sealed deliberately and had waited. Inside, everything was wrapped in individual plastic sleeves, organized with the care of a man who understood that what he was protecting needed to survive for as long as it needed to survive. Photographs first. Printed on archival paper, labeled on the back in her father's handwriting. Underwater photographs taken with a dedicated dive camera, the depth indicated in the timestamp data, the location coordinates printed in the border. She laid them across the table. The wreck of a large vessel on the seafloor. The hull intact in sections, partially collapsed in others, draped in 40 years of Gulf marine growth. On the hull, still readable through the growth and the depth, the letters Gulf Meridian. And in the photographs, showing the interior sections through gaps in the collapsed cargo hold walls shapes. Rectangular shapes. Cases. The unmistakable outline of crated objects, some stacked, some scattered by the force of the sinking and the years since, but present. Substantially present. Intact. The art collection. Still on the seafloor. Still attached to the claim her father had filed and Gerald Marsh had been slowly suffocating for 11 years. Behind the photographs, the marine archaeologist's survey document, and behind that, a final document she hadn't seen in the legal envelope. A notarized letter, sealed with a notary stamp and witness signature. Dated 3 years ago, the same year as the last logbook entry, the year of the word waiting. Signed by Robert James Calloway, witnessed by a notary in a town 40 miles from Portsmouth. The letter transferred all assets held in or on the vessel, the Margaret Rose physical metal, documents, claims, rights, interests, The vessel itself to Nora Marie Calloway, his daughter, effective upon his death, structured as a vessel asset transfer rather than an estate bequest. A vessel asset transfer did not go through probate. It did not require a will. It attached to the vessel title and transferred with the vessel. Gerald Marsh had burned the will. He had stolen the file copy from David Tran's office. He had filed fabricated loan documentation and claimed the estate and taken the house and the savings and the truck and the tools and everything he could see and calculate and take. Every move he'd made with the thoroughness and patience of a man who had been planning it for years. And none of it had reached the vessel title. Because the vessel title had sold at public auction for $50 to a woman he'd watched raise her hand and written off in the same breath. Nora sat in the crew quarters of the Margaret Rose and held the notarized transfer document in both hands. The light through the porthole had gone to afternoon gold, the low angle of a Gulf winter day, and it hit the surface of the document and made the notary seal show clearly. She thought about her father waiting at the bottom of the last logbook page. She thought about the way he'd sounded on the phone the last time they'd talked, 3 months before he died, matter of fact, a little tired, but with something underneath it that she'd taken for contentment and now understood differently. Not contentment. Completion. The specific feeling of a man who had finished the last thing he needed to do and could rest. He protected everything, she said. He put it in a place where the only way to access it was to own the boat. And Gerald didn't own the boat because Gerald didn't know what was in it. And Gerald didn't know what was in it because my father was the quietest, most patient man anyone in this town had ever underestimated. Clarence was looking at the photographs of the wreck laid out on the table. 45 to 70 million, he said, on the conservative end of the survey estimate. That was 8 years ago. The collection's value has only moved in one direction since then. And $1.1 million in metal. Right now? Accessible. With Simone Arsenault filing the new claim registration. He looked at her. Gerald Marsh has been blocking a dead man's application. Tomorrow he starts blocking yours. And you're not dead, and you're not working alone, and you have every document your father spent 30 years protecting. Nora set the transfer document down on the table with the photographs and the survey and the Coast Guard report. She looked at the full spread of it, the shape of what her father had built, visible all at once for the first time. 30 years of living simply. 30 years of buying a few coins at a time, a few silver bars at a time, from spread-out dealers and offshore ports and estate sales. Never enough at any moment to attract notice. All of it going into the compartments of a boat he'd maintained carefully while letting her exterior go to rust so no one would think to look. 30 years of researching a shipwreck and filing a legal claim and waiting, patiently and without complaint, for the moment when the claim could be pursued by someone Gerald Marsh hadn't prepared for. He'd waited for her. He'd built it for her. He'd hidden it in the one place Gerald would walk past, because Gerald's eyes only went where his calculations told him to look. Tomorrow morning, Nora said. Simone Arsenault arrives. 9 o'clock, Clarence said. Before she gets here, I want to get everything out of these compartments and into your storage unit. The metal, the originals. She looked at the USB drive. And I want 3 more copies of everything on this drive, in 3 more places. Tonight, he agreed. She looked at the porthole. The afternoon light was still golden, still quiet. Somewhere 2 blocks from the marina, on Canal Street, there was an office with gold lettering on the door. Gerald Marsh was sitting behind his desk, doing something, unaware that the thing he'd been systematically preventing for 11 years was about to start moving again. Unaware that the $50 boat he'd watched go to auction had been transformed, in the careful work of a man he'd underestimated for 30 years, into the one door he'd forgotten to close. Unaware that his door closing had missed exactly one thing. He's going to find out soon, Nora said. Yes, Clarence said, but not tonight. And by tomorrow morning, it won't matter when he finds out. She picked up the transfer document and folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of her jacket, where she could feel it against her ribs. The physical weight of it was negligible. The weight it carried was something else entirely. Simone Arsenault arrived at 7:48 in the morning, 11 minutes before she'd said she would, which told Nora something immediately about the kind of lawyer she was. She drove a gray sedan with a New Orleans parking permit on the dash and a backseat full of legal files and the contained energy of someone who had been awake and working since before the drive. She was 52, or somewhere near it, With close-cut natural hair and reading glasses she wore on top of her head as a permanent fixture, and the particular directness of a person who had spent 2 decades dealing with people who wanted to obscure things and had stopped having patience for anything that wasted time. She shook Nora's hand, shook Clarence's hand, said nothing further, and sat down at the table in Clarence's kitchen where Nora had spread the documents in the sequence her father's notebook had specified. She read for 41 minutes without speaking. Nora made coffee. Clarence sat in the corner and watched Simone the way he watched engine problems attentively, without interfering. Outside the kitchen window, the marsh sat gray and still in the morning light, the gulf invisible past the treeline, but present in the smell of the air that came through the old window frame. Simone turned the last page of the survey document and set it down. She took her reading glasses off her head, cleaned them with the hem of her jacket, and put them back. "The transfer document is valid," she said. It was not a question. Notarized, witnessed, properly formatted. Attached to the vessel title rather than the estate. Not probate eligible and not challengeable through the estate proceedings because it predates the estate dispute by 3 years and exists as a separate legal instrument. She looked at Nora. "Gerald Marsh cannot touch it. That's what we thought." "It's not what you thought. It's what is." Simone pulled the salvage claim documents toward her. The original claim was filed correctly. Coast Guard acknowledgement is on file. The Federal Maritime Court assignment is documented. The 11 years of procedural objections filed by Marsh and Associates are individually within the bounds of normal legal practice. But collectively, she tapped the stack. Collectively, they constitute a pattern of deliberate delay that a good federal judge is going to find very interesting. "Can we move the claim now?" Clarence asked from the corner. As of this morning, Nora Calloway is the registered owner of the vessel that filed the original claim. The claim transfers with vessel ownership under the maritime regulations that govern this type of salvage filing. I will file a notice of ownership transfer and a motion to reinstate active review of the claim today. She looked at Nora. Marsh and Associates will file an objection. They'll argue procedural grounds. I'll argue that 11 years of procedural delay constitutes obstruction and request expedited review. I've done it before. It works. "How long?" Nora asked. "Before the claim resolves?" 3 to 4 months if the judge is efficient. 6 if he isn't. During that time, the federal court will prohibit any other party from filing competing claims on the wreck. Marsh is frozen out from the moment I file today. "And the physical metal?" Clarence said. "Already yours under the transfer document. A professional appraisal this afternoon if you want one." She paused. "I'd recommend it. An independent verified appraisal creates a documented record that makes it substantially harder for anyone to argue the values later." Nora thought about Gerald Marsh in the marina office on Thursday morning, coffee in hand, watching her raise her hand for $50 with that patient half-smile, confirming that she was exactly what he'd always decided she was. "When do you file?" she asked. "When I walk out of here," Simone said. She filed from her car, using a secured federal court portal, at 8:44 that morning. She sent a confirmation to Nora's phone at 8:47 with a case number and a timestamp that would, from that moment forward, establish the priority of Nora's claim over any competing interest. She called at 9:15 from the drive back to New Orleans to say she'd also filed a formal complaint with the Louisiana State Bar regarding the pattern of procedural delay by Marsh and Associates. "The bar complaint does 2 things," Simone said. 1, it goes on record. 2, it tells Gerald Marsh that you're not just pursuing the claim, you're pursuing him specifically. That changes his calculations. Is that what we want? You want him thinking about his license and his reputation at the same time he's trying to fight your claim. Divided attention produces mistakes. A brief pause. He's going to come at you hard in the next few days. Legal pressure first, then something less formal. Be ready for both. "I'm ready," Nora said. She was not entirely ready. Gerald Marsh found out about the filing within 4 hours. His contact at the Federal Maritime Court Clerk's office sent him an alert whenever filings came in naming Marsh and Associates in any capacity, a professional courtesy arrangement he'd cultivated for years and probably considered one of his better investments. By noon, Renner called from a number she hadn't given him. "Miss Calloway, Mr. Marsh would like to discuss the recent court filings. He's concerned there may be some misunderstanding about the legal status of the salvage claim, There's no misunderstanding, Nora said. My attorney is handling the filing. If Mr. Marsh has legal objections, they can be directed to her. She gave him Simone's contact information and hung up. Gerald's firm filed its objection the same afternoon. 47 pages, citing 11 separate procedural grounds. Simone sent Nora a copy with a single line of commentary. As expected, I have seen longer and weaker. She filed her response at 7 the next morning. The town of Portsmouth found out in pieces, the way small towns absorb information not all at once, but in layers, through the particular osmosis of a community where everyone knew everyone's business except the things that mattered. The marina director, who had called Gerald when Nora came back to the boat, became noticeably unavailable when she passed the marina office. Pete Delaney from Salvage stopped her at the gas station to ask questions framed as friendly interest but clearly reconnaissance. The woman at the front desk of Gerald's office watched Nora walk past the window one morning and looked away a half-second too slowly. Word traveled. The shape of it changed as it moved, as words always do in a town where the full story is unknown and people fill the gaps with what they know and what they guess. The Portsmouth Gazette ran the story on the Salvage case first, a brief piece, factual, understated, buried on page 4, written by a reporter named Calvin Mouton, who had covered the town for 20 years and understood the difference between what he could prove and what he suspected. The headline read, "Local Woman Files Federal Maritime Claim on Inherited Vessel." The story contained no details about the physical metal, no details about the collection's value, no mention of Gerald Marsh by name beyond a dry reference to the legal objection filed by his firm. It was enough. In a town of 11,000, a story buried on page 4 read by 200 people is a story that reaches 11,000 by Tuesday. The details Mouton had omitted were supplied generously by the people who filled them in. She was at the laundry sorting table covering a shift for a colleague, old habits not yet broken, when Ed Fontenot, who ran the shrimp boat cooperative 3 slips down from slip 14, came in with his wife's dryer sheets and spent 4 minutes telling her things she already knew about her own situation in a tone that managed to be simultaneously congratulatory and deeply curious. She thanked him and sorted linens. The harder conversations came from people who had known her father. The hardware store owner who'd watched Gerald claim the estate without comment found her in the paint aisle and said only, "Robert would be glad you came back." She thanked him and bought primer. Cecile at Thibodeau's put a slice of pie on her table without being asked and said, "I should have said something when it happened, and I'm sorry I didn't." Nora ate the pie and said, "You're saying something now." The marina director left a handwritten note in slip 14's postbox. It said, "I made a call I shouldn't have made. I'm sorry." It was unsigned, which she found characteristic of the particular courage of people who feel guilty but not enough to put their name on it. She filed it and said nothing and continued her work on the hull. What they knew, Nora Calloway had bought her father's old tugboat at auction for $50. What they guessed, sentimental, impractical, broke, something legally odd. What they didn't know yet was the scope of what she'd found inside, and she and Clarence worked to keep that unknown for as long as possible. The professional appraiser came on a Tuesday, a man named Bertrand who operated out of Lafayette and specialized in precious metals and numismatic currency. He spent 3 hours on the boat with a scale and a loop and a current spot price feed on his laptop, and he produced a report that afternoon. Physical gold, 460 American Eagle 1-ounce coins. Total appraised value range, $912,000 to $947,000. Physical silver, commodity rounds and bars plus numismatic Morgan dollar collection. Total silver range, $253,400 to $280,400. Combined physical metal, $1,165,400 to $1,227,400. He handed her the report in a manila envelope and said, without editorializing, "Whoever accumulated this was very patient." 30 years, Nora said. Bertrand looked at the compartments, properly sealed now, and at the boat around him. "He hid it well," he said. "I wouldn't have found half of these without the diagram. That was the idea." The professional appraiser, Bertrand, had said nothing else after his comment about patience, which Nora respected. He packed his equipment back into his cases with the care of a man who handled valuable instruments and drove back to Lafayette without lingering. But his report, when she read it in the car with the engine off and the afternoon going to dark around her, did something to her that she hadn't expected. It wasn't the number. The number was extraordinary, but it was also abstract, a figure on paper that would take months of legal processing before it existed in any form she could use. What stopped her was the appendix at the back of the report, which Bertrand had added as a professional annotation, a note on the condition of the storage compartments themselves. He'd written that the powder coating on the interior of each metal box showed no moisture penetration, that the gaskets remained fully functional, and that the coins themselves, while handled during accumulation, showed no signs of environmental deterioration. He wrote, "The storage methodology demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of long-term metal preservation, with each compartment evidently designed for indefinite maintenance-free storage." Indefinite maintenance-free storage. Her father had built compartments that would hold what he put in them for as long as they needed to hold it, for as long as it took. He had not built them for 5 years or 10. He had built them for however long was necessary. She thought about that word on the logbook page again. Not impatient waiting, not anxious waiting. The specific waiting of a man who had done everything within his power and was now simply letting time complete the job. Waiting the way a craftsman waits after the last coat of finish, not with doubt, but with the settled knowledge that the work is done and the outcome will be what the work deserves. She walked off the boat with the appraisal report in her tote bag and Lily's pickup 40 minutes away and the Gulf light going amber over the marina, and she sat in her car for 5 minutes before starting the engine. $1,165,000 at the low end of the appraisal, in physical metal, documented and certified and legally hers by the transfer document that Gerald Marsh had not known to look for. She thought about the Bayview Motel at $42 a night. She thought about the rice and beans from the gas station on Claiborne. She thought about the school lunch account she still owed. She transferred enough from the metal sale which Simone arranged through a licensed dealer over 3 days to pay the motel bill for the rest of the month, to pay the school lunch account in full plus a surplus, to buy Lily the school sweatshirt and a jacket that fit properly. She put the remainder in a bank account in her name at an institution in Lafayette that Gerald Marsh had no existing relationship with. She did not look for a new home yet. She was waiting on something else. 3 weeks after Simone's filing, the Federal Maritime Court issued its ruling on the motion. Active review reinstated. Expedited timeline granted. Marsh and Associates' 11-year pattern of procedural objection noted in the ruling's findings not condemned in terms the bar complaint would need, but noted, which in judicial language meant, we see what was happening here. A temporary protective order established that no competing claims on the Gulf Meridian wreck could be filed or registered pending resolution of the primary claim. Gerald Marsh was frozen out of the claim he'd spent 11 years controlling through delay. Simone called the morning the ruling came through. 3 to 4 months. I'm pushing for 3. The judge is efficient. The pressure from Gerald's side intensified after the ruling. His firm challenged the vessel ownership transfer. Simone filed the notary's certification and witness attestation within 48 hours, and the challenge collapsed. His firm filed a motion arguing the salvage claim should be invalidated because the original claimant was deceased. Simone filed the maritime regulations establishing that claims transferred with vessel ownership and had done so under established precedent for 130 years. That motion collapsed. He tried one more avenue. A man came to the marina, not Renner, someone younger with a less practiced manner, and told the marina director that the vessel at Slip 14 appeared to be in violation of several Port Authority compliance requirements. The marina director passed this along to Nora with an expression suggesting he was not entirely comfortable being the messenger. Nora called Simone. Simone called the Port Authority district office directly, identifying herself as counsel for the vessel owner and requesting clarification on what specific compliance issues had been identified and through what formal reporting process. The district officer, a federal employee outside the network Gerald operated through, reviewed the file and informed Simone that no compliance violations had been formally reported for the vessel in question. The pressure stopped, not because Gerald had given up, because he had run out of moves that didn't require stepping into the light of things he couldn't afford to have examined publicly. The bar complaint was active. The federal court had noted the delay pattern on record. A man who operated through conditions and leverage and carefully cultivated pressure just below the threshold of visibility, had reached the point where visible moves were the only ones left, and visible moves were the ones that could be used against him. He had one option remaining: wait and see if Nora's claim would hold. He waited. So did Nora. She did not waste the waiting. She moved out of the Bayview Motel on the 1st of February into a rented house on the south side of Portsmouth, 3 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen with a proper stove. Lily got her own room for the first time in 5 months, and spent the first evening arranging it with the focused seriousness of someone who intended to stay. She put drawings on the walls. She organized her books. She sat on the bed and looked around. "This is a good room, Mom," she said. "It is," Nora said. "Are we staying?" "Yes, baby. We're staying." She enrolled Lily formally in the Portsmouth school, made the lunch account whole with a surplus, bought a winter jacket and the school sweatshirt she'd asked for twice and stopped asking for. She paid the goodwill back in a manner of speaking, donating twice what she'd spent there over the last 5 months. The underwater photographs from the salvage operation were not released publicly during the legal proceedings, but after the appraisal was complete and the claim resolved, Simone confirmed that Nora had the right to do with them what she wished. She gave them to Calvin Mouton at the Gazette on a Tuesday morning, along with the appraisal document and a brief statement she'd written herself. The story ran on the front page on Wednesday. The photographs showed the Gulf Meridian on the seafloor, the cargo hold, the cases visible through the gaps. The appraisal document, summarized accurately, showed the total. Mouton's reporting was careful and specific and named Gerald Marsh in every relevant context, because at that point there was no legal reason not to. The story was picked up by the Associated Press by Thursday afternoon. By Friday it had reached national outlets. By the weekend, Nora's phone, a new one, with a plan she could now afford, was receiving calls she did not answer from numbers she did not recognize. Simone handled the media inquiries. Nora went to the boat and sanded the port rail. She was not unaffected by the attention. She would not have been human if she were. But she had spent 5 months learning the difference between what looked like something and what was actually something, and a news cycle, however loud, was firmly in the first category. What was actually something was Lily having a room of her own and a jacket that fit, and a school lunch account with a surplus. What was actually something was Clarence showing up on Saturday morning with marine plywood in the bed of his truck. What was actually something was the Margaret Rose coming back to herself one weekend at a time. The rest was noise. She started going to the boat every day. Not to look for things she'd missed. Every compartment had been found and documented and emptied under the appraiser's supervision. She went because the boat needed work and she was a woman who knew how to work, and because doing something with her hands while a federal court process ran its course was better than doing nothing. She started with the hull above the waterline, grinding rust, treating metal, priming sections in the early mornings when the light was right. Clarence came on the weekends and worked alongside her without being asked, bringing materials and his knowledge of what the boat needed and the comfortable silence of a person who has worked alongside another person long enough that conversation was optional. The winch drum yielded to heat and penetrating oil and 3 Saturdays of patient work. The wheelhouse windows were reglazed where the crack had let salt in behind the frame. The deck box was rebuilt from marine-grade plywood sourced from Morgan City. The gangplank got new treads. The exterior paint, the white that had gone to mottled gray-brown, was sanded back and reprimed and repainted over 6 consecutive weekends, the boat going from the color of neglect to something that looked, for the first time in years, like a vessel someone cared about. Lily came on Saturdays. She learned to use a wire brush and then a grinder under Clarence's patient supervision, wearing safety glasses too big for her face, moving with the focused deliberateness of a child who had decided the work was worth taking seriously. She asked questions about the hull and the engine and the winch, and Clarence answered them directly and specifically and without condescension, treating the questions as what they were, a person trying to understand something. "Clarence," Lily said one afternoon, sitting on the deck eating a sandwich, "did you know my grandfather was hiding all that stuff in here?" "I suspected he was doing something. I didn't know what." "Were you surprised when you found out?" Clarence thought about it honestly. "Not as surprised as I should have been. Your grandfather was a man who thought ahead. 30 years is a long way to think, but it suited him." Lily considered this. "Mom thinks like that too, just not as far yet." Nora, sanding the port rail, chose not to respond. In the 9th week after Simone's filing, the Federal Maritime Court confirmed the salvage operation authorization. The authorization established Nora as the primary salvage claimant, established the wreck's coordinates and the salvage area's boundaries, and required the engagement of a licensed commercial salvage company with federal certification. Simone had a shortlist ready. Nora chose Gulf Reef Recovery, based in Morgan City, which had completed 12 previous authorized salvage operations in the Gulf and had a project manager named Delphine Tran who walked Nora through the operational plan over 2 phone calls with the patience and clarity of someone who had adjusted her explanations for a client who was not a maritime professional but was clearly paying close attention. The operation took 3 weeks. The salvage crew's project manager, Delphine Tran, had told Nora during their second phone call that the most common misconception about salvage operations was that they were primarily about finding things. That part, she said, was often straightforward once you had the coordinates and the authorization. The harder part was the recovery, working in conditions that didn't cooperate, with equipment that had to be perfect, with cargo that had waited decades and couldn't afford to be damaged in the final meters of its journey. She'd been right. Nora watched the operation from the support vessel's deck in the early mornings, the dive team. Going down in rotation in the cool Gulf water, the crane operator working with the particular focused calm of a person doing a job that had very little margin for carelessness. Each item came up slowly, controlled ascent, the buoyancy balanced against the weight, the crane taking over at the surface as the crate broke water and was guided to the cargo bay. On the 3rd day, she asked Delphine how many of the items they expected to recover undamaged. Delphine looked at the surface of the water and thought about it. Damage depends on what we're talking about, she said. The pre-Columbian pieces in sealed archival cases, those were packed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. They should be fine. The paintings are the variable. 40 years submerged, the cases sealed, the depth cold enough to slow deterioration significantly. The conservator thinks we'll see somewhere between 80 and 90% condition. Maybe better. 80% of a $67 million collection, Nora said. 80% of whatever it is. Delphine paused. Your father picked a good wreck to find. Cold, deep water, low biological activity in the cargo hold because of the depth, intact hull sections protecting the hold. He did his research. Nora looked at the Gulf around her. He had done his research. He had done all of it. The research, the claim, the waiting, the building, the patient accumulation with the same care he'd brought to every other thing she'd ever seen him do. He had not been lucky. He had been thorough, over 30 years, in the specific way that thoroughness begins to look like luck from the outside when the results arrive all at once. A support vessel anchored over the Gulf Meridian's location. A dive team working in rotation confirmed the survey findings. The cargo hold sections were substantially intact, the marine growth manageable, the structural integrity of the relevant sections sufficient for controlled extraction. The crates and cases came up one by one over 17 working days, lifted by controlled buoyancy and crane, transferred to the support vessel's sealed cargo bay, photographed and cataloged at the surface with a conservator present. Nora was on the support vessel for the first 3 days and the last 2. On the first morning, when the dive team confirmed the first crate was intact and visible and ready for extraction, she stood at the rail and looked at the Gulf around her, flat and green in the morning light. Unremarkable in every direction, hiding nothing anyone passing would have known to look for, and she thought about her father running this same water 20-some years ago, watching his depth finder show an anomaly on the seafloor and knowing what it was and understanding what it meant, for what he'd already been building for a decade. Coming home from that run and writing it in his research notes. Calling the Coast Guard and filing the report the correct way, through proper channels, documented, legitimate, trusting that the system would function. And then watching Gerald Marsh's firm turn up in the opposing filing and understanding that the system would not function in this particular case, not without a lever Gerald couldn't reach. Going home and thinking about what lever that might be, and finding the answer in a boat he already owned and a daughter he was already protecting and 30 years of patience that cost him nothing but time. The 41st item extracted from the Gulf Meridian's cargo hold was a painting in a sealed case that the conservator identified when the case was carefully opened in the controlled environment of the support vessel's cargo bay, as a work by the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. She said this in a quiet voice and asked everyone to step back, and let her work. Nora stepped back and looked at the painting, vivid even through the decades, even through the depth, the colors carrying something the water had not taken from them, and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not triumph. Something older than triumph. Something that had been waiting a long time to exist. The full recovery was 63 items. Paintings, sculptures, pre-Columbian artifacts in sealed archival containers, documents, and a collection of 20th-century Mexican modernist works that the conservator kept describing in careful professional language while visibly containing her reaction to what she was looking at. The formal appraisal took 6 weeks, conducted by an international art valuation firm with specialists in Mexican colonial and modern art and pre-Columbian artifacts. Each item was evaluated independently. Condition noted. Provenance research conducted. Market comparables identified. The appraisal result came on a Thursday morning in late spring, in a 42-page document that concluded with a total 63 items. Combined estimated market value at current auction, $67,400,000. Nora read the number 3 times. Then she called Simone. 67.4, she said. I see it. Simone had a copy. Under the salvage law structure, your entitlement is 75% of the recovered value after documented recovery costs. Recovery costs came to $3,200,000. Your net claim is approximately $48 million. $48 million. From a salvage claim her father had filed 11 years ago on a wreck he'd found during a freight run, documented legally and correctly, and watched get buried under procedural delays by a man who had underestimated the patience of the person filing it. Gerald's objection to the claim? Nora asked. Denied in full. The court found the claim valid in all particulars and the opposing filings without substantive merit. The court also referred the 11 years of procedural filings to the Department of Justice for review as potential obstruction of a federal court process. Separate proceeding. Longer timeline. But it's on record. And the estate matter? The bar complaint is proceeding. There's also been a referral from the DOJ review to the State Attorney General's office regarding the estate proceedings, the fabricated loan documentation, and the destruction of the will. That investigation is active. Nora sat at the kitchen table of the rented house on the south side of Portsmouth with the phone in her hand and the appraisal document on the table and the morning light coming through the window she'd opened to let the spring air in. Gerald Marsh was not in handcuffs. He was not ruined yet. The investigations would take time, and investigations could arrive at outcomes that felt insufficient for what they were investigating. She understood this. She had spent 5 months living with the reality that legal processes moved slowly and didn't always produce proportional results. But the salvage claim had resolved. The money was hers. The investigations were running. And Gerald Marsh, who had built his career on invisible pressure and conditions created just below the threshold of sight, was now the subject of 3 separate formal proceedings that were very much visible. He called her that afternoon. Not through Renner, not through a lawyer. Himself, on her phone. She answered. Nora. His voice was the same as it had always been, measured, unhurried. The voice of a man still deciding what kind of conversation this was going to be. I wanted to call personally. Okay. A pause. She let it sit. Your father was a remarkable man, he said. I underestimated him. I think you know that. I know that. I underestimated you as well. She didn't respond to this. I imagine the investigations will proceed, he said. I have lawyers. My position on the estate matter is documented. The procedural filings were standard legal practice. But I understand that appearances, Gerald, she said. He stopped. My father spent 30 years building something in secret because he understood that you would take it if you saw it. He did it carefully and patiently, and he never told anyone because telling people wasn't safe. He died without knowing if it would work. She paused. It worked. What you want to call me about now, I don't need to hear. A long silence on the line. No, he said finally. I suppose not. He hung up. She set the phone on the table and sat for a moment. Outside, through the open window, the marsh ran its ordinary sounds: birds, wind through the reeds, a boat engine somewhere on the water, brine and earth, and the sweetness of a Louisiana spring, which was the smell she associated most strongly with her father, with the particular quality of his presence, the way he'd always seemed most completely himself outdoors near the Gulf. She had not let herself grieve him properly since the funeral. There had been too much to do. Too many immediate things pressing on the space where grief would have gone if she'd had room for it. She sat at the kitchen table and gave it the room it needed. He had known he might not see it resolved. He'd written the letter knowing that. He'd built the compartments and hidden the metal and filed the claim and organized the notebooks and sealed the dry box and adjusted the trim ballast to make the boat list convincingly to port all of it done, understanding that there was a meaningful chance he would die before any of it was used. He'd been a 61-year-old man with a quietly failing heart, and he'd kept building anyway. Not for himself. For her. For the daughter he'd raised on a Gulf Coast dock and sent into a world that had given her real difficulty, and who he'd trusted, finally, and without reservation, to come back and finish what he'd started. You always were enough. She sat with that for a while. The formal legal resolution of the salvage claim came in June. The proceeds net of recovery costs, legal fees, and appraisal charges settled into an account in her name at the institution Simone had established for that purpose. $47,960,000. Plus the metal appraisal, now fully liquidated. $1,192,640 after the Morgandollar auction came in at the high end of the estimate. She sat with Simone and a financial advisor named Patricia Corville, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had an expression of permanent calm skepticism that Nora found deeply reassuring. They spent 2 days going through the structure of it. Taxes, trusts, designated accounts. The practical architecture of a sum of money large enough to be its own kind of responsibility. What do you want to do with it? Patricia asked. Nora had been thinking about this for a long time. On the boat with the sanding block in her hand. In the car on the way to Lily's school. In the rented house at night, when the spring storms came off the Gulf and rattled the windows. The record, she said. My father's estate. The house on Cypress Lane. I want what the investigation determines about the fabricated documentation. Not to take the house back necessarily. I have a home. Lily has a room. But I want the record corrected. I want what my father built and owned named as his. The house can be dealt with after. The record is what matters. Patricia made a note. What else? A foundation. For families who lose things the way we almost lost everything through legal processes designed to help people, but weaponized when the other side has money and patience. Legal assistance. Document preservation. People who understand what happened to them, but don't have the means to fight it. She thought about David Tran in Homa, standing at his empty filing cabinet, apologetic and frightened. People who shouldn't have to depend on a daughter showing up at the right moment with $50 and a pry bar. Simone looked at her over the table. That's a real gap, she said. I've seen it for 20 years. I know. My father trusted that the right person would find what he'd hidden and know what to do with it. I want to make sure other families don't have to depend on that kind of trust, on that kind of luck. The Portsmouth Town Council had its first formal discussion of the salvage case outcome in July, at a regular meeting that was less regular than usual. 7 of the 15 seats in the public gallery were occupied by journalists. The remaining 8 held residents who had heard enough of the story to want to be present when the people who governed the town had to acknowledge it publicly. Gerald Marsh resigned from the council the week before the meeting, citing personal reasons. His resignation was accepted with a brief statement of thanks for his service and a silence from the room that expressed considerably more than the statement did. The state attorney general's investigation concluded in August. The fabricated loan documentation was found to be fraudulent. The estate transfer to Gerald Marsh was declared void. A civil judgment was entered against Marsh personally for the value of assets wrongfully transferred, plus interest from the date of the funeral. His attorneys were negotiating the terms of restitution when Nora's Foundation's legal arm filed a separate civil action on behalf of 3 other Portsmouth families who had identified similar patterns in their own dealings with Marsh and Associates going back 8 years. The foundation incorporated in October under the name the Robert Calloway Legal Defense Fund, which was Nora's first choice and which Patricia Corville, the financial advisor, initially suggested might be too plain. Nora kept it. Plain was what her father had been. Plain was what had allowed him to build something extraordinary without anyone seeing it coming. She did not want the foundation to have a name that obscured what it did. The first case the foundation took on was in Plaquemines Parish, 60 miles south of Portsmouth. A family named Trosclair who owned waterfront property their grandfather had acquired in 1952 and had been pressured for 3 years by a development company using manipulated tax assessments and insurance challenges to force a sale. The same pattern applied to different people in a different parish by different actors who had learned what worked from watching what worked. The Foundation's legal team, 2 attorneys Simone had recommended from her network, both with public interest backgrounds, filed on their behalf in November. The case resolved in January with the development company withdrawing its pressure campaign and paying a settlement that covered the Trosclair family's 3 years of legal costs and additional damages for documented distress. 3 more cases came in the first 6 months, then 7 more. The Foundation hired a case coordinator and a community outreach person and established a referral relationship with the State Attorney General's office, which found the Foundation's documented case files useful in ways that worked to everyone's advantage. By the end of the first year, 12 families had received direct legal assistance, and 4 had seen their cases resolved favorably. Nora attended none of the hearings. She sent checks and read reports and showed up to the quarterly board meetings and trusted Simone's judgment on everything procedural, because her father had taught her that trusting the right people's judgment on things they knew better than you wasn't weakness. It was the practical intelligence of a man who hired the best mechanic he could find and then let the mechanic do his work. She didn't attend any of the proceedings. She had a lawyer who attended proceedings. She had things to do. Patricia Corville, the financial advisor, had asked what Nora wanted to do with the money, and Nora had answered. But there was a part of the answer she hadn't fully voiced in that meeting, because it felt too personal to put into the language of foundations and legal structures. She'd gone back to it alone, in the rented house, on a night when the spring rain was coming sideways off the Gulf and Lily was asleep and the house was quiet. She had spent the last 5 months in a form of poverty that was temporary but not trivial. $42 a night in a motel. Rice and beans and hot-plate eggs. The worn jacket, the wrong-sized shoes, the school lunch account she couldn't reload. Lily eating without complaint. Lily not asking for the sweatshirt a 3rd time. Lily understanding something about their situation that an 8-year-old should not have had to understand, and adapting to it with a grace that had simultaneously broken Nora's heart and filled her with the particular pride of watching your child be better than the circumstances they've been handed. She had been 5 months from something much worse. Not dramatically worse, she was not in danger of anything acute, but the math of it had been pointing somewhere she didn't want to follow, and the boat had interrupted the math before it arrived anywhere final. She thought about other people for whom the math was still pointing. People without a father who had spent 30 years quietly building a way out. People without a Clarence Webb who showed up at 8:15 in the morning with the answer already decided before you asked the question. People who had lost things through the same mechanisms, the same manufactured assessments, the same manipulated filings, the same patient systemic pressure, and had no lever to reach because no one had hidden one in the right place. That was the rest of the answer, not just legal assistance. The knowledge that someone was looking for the lever before it was needed, and building structures so that when the wrong people came for what belonged to you, the right people would already be in position. It was, she realized, exactly what her father had done for her, just at scale. She bought the Margaret Rose. This required a technical clarification. She already owned the Margaret Rose, had owned her since the $50 auction. What she was buying was the overhaul, the full restoration. She contracted Gulf Reef Recovery's Vessel Services Division and a marine diesel mechanic from Morgan City and a shipwright from Homa who specialized in older commercial vessels, and she worked alongside all of them for 4 months, personally, showing up at the marina in the mornings with coffee and tools and the working knowledge of someone who had been around boats her whole life and hadn't forgotten any of it. The engine was rebuilt. The hull was hauled and the keel welds inspected and the below waterline coating replaced. The wheelhouse was restored, new glass, rebuilt console, the original chart table refinished. The deck was stripped and the non-slip surface replaced, and the towing cleats repolished to the brightness they'd had when her father bought the boat in 1988. The winch drum freed and inspected and greased. The gangplank replaced entirely. She had the exterior painted white, the same white as the original, and the name repainted on the stern in the same style as the original lettering. The Margaret Rose, in clean black capitals, with Portsmouth, LA below it. On the morning the boat went back in the water after the haul out, Clarence Webb stood at the end of the dock and watched the crane lower her into the slip. He had been to every working day of the restoration, fixing things that needed fixing, advising on things he wasn't fixing, occasionally sitting in the wheelhouse with his coffee and watching Nora work in the particular attentive silence of a man who is observing something he is glad to be present for. When the hull touched the water and the crane lines went slack and the boat settled into the slip on an even keel both sides, for the first time since Robert Calloway had deliberately adjusted the trim ballast to make her look worse than she was, Clarence looked at her for a long moment. "She floats true," he said. "She does," Nora said. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who had been waiting to see this specific thing and was satisfied now that he had. He picked up his coffee cup and said nothing more, and the morning moved on. Lily, who had been doing homework at the dock box she'd claimed as a work surface, came to look. She stood at the edge of the slip and studied the boat with the frank assessment she'd applied to things since she was 4 years old and had only gotten more precise with age. The white hull, the clean deck, the name on the stern, the black letters crisp in the morning light. "Grandpa would like it," she said. "Yes," Nora said. "He would. Are we going to use it?" Nora looked at the boat, at the waterline sitting even and honest, at the wheelhouse where the photograph of her parents was still on the shelf above the windshield, where she'd left it the day she first came aboard with a pry bar and a flashlight and a dead man's instructions and $50 she couldn't afford to spend. "I'm thinking about running Frayed," she said. "Short routes. Gulf Coast cargo. There's still work if you want it, and you have a sound vessel." Lily considered this. "Can I come sometimes?" "When you're not in school." "On weekends." "On weekends." Lily nodded with the decisive finality of someone who had reached a satisfactory conclusion. She went back to her homework. Nora stood at the end of the dock a while longer. She thought about what her father had built, and how he'd built it, and how long it had taken, and how much of it depended on things he couldn't control. On her coming back, on her going to the boat, on $50 being enough, on Gerald Marsh's dismissal of a rusting vessel being absolute and unexamined. So many contingencies, so many points at which the whole construction could have failed to connect. And at every point, it had held. Not because of luck, exactly. Because her father had understood the people involved, understood Gerald's blindness to things he'd already dismissed, understood Nora's nature, understood that a daughter raised on a working dock would eventually come back to a working dock. He'd designed around the people rather than around ideal conditions, and the people had behaved as he'd designed for them to behave. He'd trusted her, specifically, precisely, with the full weight of what he'd built. She had not known how much that mattered until she understood, standing at this dock in this morning light with the boat floating true behind her, and her daughter doing long division on a dock box, and Clarence Webb heading back to his shed to fix someone else's engine, that it was the thing she would carry longest from all of it. Not the money, not the resolution of the claim, not the investigation findings, or the council resignation, or any of the formal outcomes. The trust, the 30-year, patient, unhurried trust of a man who had decided, without reservation and without requiring confirmation, that his daughter was enough to handle what he was leaving her. She went to the wheelhouse. She took the photograph from the shelf and sat in the captain's chair reupholstered during the restoration, the original vinyl pattern, the same brown, and looked at her parents in it. Her mother, laughing at something outside the frame. Her father, half turned toward the camera, the expression she'd know anywhere. A boat freshly painted. A dock. The water behind them going to light. She set the photograph back on the shelf, face up, in the same spot where it had sat face down for 3 years, and she went out to the deck and started the engine. The Caterpillar diesel turned over on the third crank and settled into the deep, even rhythm of an engine that had been properly rebuilt by someone who knew what they were doing. It moved through the hull the way she remembered from childhood, that particular vibration, felt rather than heard, the signal that a working boat was ready to work. At the dock box, Lily looked up from her homework and grinned. Nora stood in the wheelhouse with her hands on the helm and the engine running under her, and Portsmouth Marina visible through the clean glass, and the Gulf invisible past the marina buildings, but present in the smell of the air brine and diesel and the sweetness of a working waterfront, and she thought, here was where he'd been waiting to bring her. Not to money, not to victory, to this. A boat with her mother's name on it, floating true, engine running, a daughter on the dock, the morning going on around all of it. She'd bought a rusting tugboat for $50, and her father had left her everything. Not because he was lucky, and not only because Gerald Marsh had made a mistake, though he had. Because one quiet man had spent 30 years deciding to trust his daughter with the full weight of what he'd built, and his daughter had come home. Some things get hidden not because they're shameful, but because the wrong people would take them if they could be seen. Some things wait in locked compartments, in rusting hulls, in the last word of a logbook that no one else thought to read for the one person they were always meant for. Robert Calloway had known exactly who that person was. He'd named a boat after her mother, trimmed the ballast so she'd list convincingly to port, organized 9 compartments with a machinist's precision, filed a federal claim through the proper channels because that was how he did everything, and left a note in an old leather satchel that said, "You always were enough." He'd been right the whole time. The first freight run happened in November, 6 weeks after the boat went back in the water. It was a short route, the kind her father had run in the final years when his back was limiting the longer jobs. Portsmouth to Homa, 42 miles. 1 pallet of commercial refrigeration parts consigned by a marine supply company that had been her father's client for 20 years and whose owner, a man named Bro, had called Nora personally after reading Calvin Mouton's story in the Gazette. He hadn't mentioned the money or the claim or any of the things that had been in the papers. He'd said, "Your father ran my freight for 19 years and never missed a delivery. I'd like to keep the account in the family if you're interested." She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. Clarence came down to the marina on the morning of the run without being asked, wearing his work jacket and carrying a thermos. He stood at the stern cleat while Nora ran the pre-departure check engine temperature, fuel level, bilge, navigation lights, radio, and said nothing until she'd finished and looked up. "You remember how to cast off?" he said. "I've been casting off since I was 8. Just checking." He handed her the thermos. "There's coffee in there. It's a cold morning." The lines came off the cleats in the order her father had always done it, a sequence he'd taught her before she could reach the cleats without standing on something. Stern first, then bow, then spring line. She'd stood on a dock box to reach them as a child. She didn't need the dock box now, and that small fact standing at her full height, doing the same thing in the same order on the same boat on a November morning, while Clarence watched from the dock with his hands in his jacket pockets, sat in her chest the way very few things had sat there since the funeral. She took the Margaret Rose out of slip 14 at 7:15 in the morning, the Caterpillar diesel running below her with the deep, even rhythm of an engine that had been properly rebuilt and was doing what it was built to do. The marina passed on either side as she cleared the slip row and turned for the channel. The waterfront passed. The town passed. The treeline gave way to open water, the marsh flat on both sides, the gulf ahead broadening as the channel widened. She ran the boat alone that first trip, not because she had to. Clarence had offered, and Bro's dispatcher had offered a hand for the loading, but because she'd wanted the first run to be quiet. She'd wanted to be alone on the water in her father's boat, doing the thing her father had done for 30 years, before she began making it her own version of the same thing. The trip took 3 hours. She delivered the pallet to the Homa Marine Depot, signed the consignment papers with Bro's agent, and sat for 20 minutes on the stern deck with her coffee and the Homa waterfront visible and the engine off and the boat rocking in the slight current of the canal. She thought about her father making this run, making some version of it this route or one nearby, the same water, the same flat sky hundreds of times. She thought about what it had cost him to keep the secret, not in the way of guilt or regret, but in the simple practical cost of living carefully, of watching what he said and to whom, of letting a boat rust on the outside while he maintained her where it mattered. She thought about the discipline that required, sustained over decades, without anyone to share it with. He had been, she thought, one of the lonelier people she'd ever loved, in a way that she hadn't understood until now. Not lonely in the way of people who lack connection, but lonely in the specific way of those who carry something that cannot be shared without endangering it. He'd carried it alone, and he'd carried it all the way to the end, and then he'd put it where she would find it. She started the engine. She ran back to Portsmouth in the afternoon light, the marsh gold on both sides, the gulf glittering past the channel mouth. She tied up at slip 14 and put the mooring lines on the cleats in the order he'd taught her, and she stood on the dock for a moment looking at the boat. It floated true on both sides. It always would now. The art collection's legal situation proved more complicated than the salvage resolution. which was the word Simone had used, complicated in the particular tone of a lawyer who means interesting and lucrative and considerably more work. The 63 recovered items from the Gulf Meridian were, legally speaking, a layered question. Nora's salvage claim gave her rights to the cargo as recovered property of a lost vessel. But cargo has a previous owner, and the previous owner in this case was technically the estate of Gerardo Fuentes Vega, the Mexican industrialist who had died 8 years earlier, having never officially acknowledged the collection's existence. The Fuentes Vega estate, administered by his son Rafael from offices in Mexico City, sent a letter through International Council in January. The letter was long and formally courteous in the way of documents written by lawyers who expect to negotiate. Its central argument was that the collection belonged to the Fuentes Vega family by inheritance, that its presence on the Gulf Meridian had been the result of unauthorized removal by parties unknown, and that the salvage recovery had returned family property, which should now be returned to its rightful heirs. Simone read the letter, sent Nora a copy, and wrote back a 3-page response in English and Spanish that addressed each point in order, cited the applicable maritime law and international salvage conventions, and concluded with a settlement framework that proposed a revenue-sharing arrangement on the collection's eventual auction precedes a percentage to the Fuentes Vega estate in exchange for a waiver of competing ownership claims and full cooperation with the provenance documentation that would be required for the pieces to be sold through any reputable auction house. Rafael Fuentes Vega's lawyers responded within 2 weeks. They counter-proposed a higher percentage. Simone countered again. The negotiation took 4 months and produced an agreement that gave the Fuentes Vega estate 22% of net auction proceeds in exchange for their full documentation cooperation and ownership waiver. The auction itself was handled by a firm in New York that specialized in Latin American art. It ran over 3 days in the fall and produced a combined hammer price that, after the Fuentes Vega percentage, the auction house's commission, and the residual legal fees, arrived in Nora's account as a figure slightly lower than the original appraisal had estimated and significantly higher than anyone outside the courtroom had yet been told. She did not publicize the final number. She didn't see the point. The number that had been in the papers, the appraisal estimate, the claim resolution, had already changed her life in every practical way it needed to. The actual deposited amount was something between her and Patricia Corville and a spreadsheet she looked at occasionally and then put away again, because money that was doing what it was supposed to do didn't require daily attention. Gerald Marsh was indicted by the Louisiana State Grand Jury in March of the following year, 14 months after the funeral. The charges were 7: 2 counts of fraud, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of obstruction of justice related to the theft of the file copy from David Tran's office, 1 count of conspiracy, and 1 count related to the destruction of a legal document, which was what burning a will in a fireplace while a grieving daughter stood 3 feet away was called in the Louisiana Criminal Code. His attorneys entered not guilty pleas on all 7 counts and filed motions that Simone's colleagues monitored, but which were not primarily her concern. Her work for Nora was substantially complete by this point, though they spoke monthly, and she'd agreed to serve on the Foundation's legal advisory board at a reduced consulting rate. The trial took 2 weeks in October. Nora did not attend. She had the boat, and she had the Foundation's case files, and she had Lily's school schedule, which included a fall science project on Gulf Coast marine ecosystems that required 3 weekend boat trips to collect water samples, and she had all of that to attend to. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on 5 of the 7 counts. Acquitted on 2 of the obstruction charges where the evidence was circumstantial. Sentencing 3 weeks later, for years and 2 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, full restitution of the civil judgment's outstanding balance. Nora was at the boat when Simone texted her the verdict. She read it, looked at the Gulf, and went back to what she'd been doing, which was helping Lily label the water sample containers in the order they'd collected them. What was that? Lily asked. News about Gerald Marsh. Lily looked up. Bad news for him. Yes. Lily considered this for a moment. Then she went back to labeling. Okay, she said, in the tone of someone filing a thing in the right category and moving on. Nora felt exactly the same. The house on Cypress Lane sat empty for 8 months after the estate transfer was declared void and the civil judgment entered against Gerald. It sat in a kind of legal interlude owned technically, by the estate of Robert Calloway, which needed to be formally administered now that the fraudulent transfer had been unwound, in which Simone was navigating through the proper channels in the Homa probate court with David Tran, who had offered his participation at no charge and whom Nora had accepted on that basis, partly because he was genuinely useful and partly because she understood that people needed the opportunity to do better than they'd done before. She walked through the house one afternoon in February, after the probate process had formally cleared and the property was unambiguously hers to enter. She went alone. She went in the daytime, middle of the afternoon, when the light through the windows was clear and showed everything plainly. The house was smaller than she remembered from childhood, which was not a surprise, places always are. The furniture was gone. Gerald had taken it or sold it during the period he'd controlled the estate, and the rooms were bare in the way of spaces recently vacated. The floors were good, her father had laid them himself, hardwood over the original subfloor, and Gerald apparently hadn't bothered with them. The kitchen had been updated at some point in the last decade. Fixtures she didn't recognize. Her old bedroom still had the nail holes in the wall where she'd hung things as a teenager. She walked through it in under 15 minutes. She stood in her father's study, the room where Gerald had stood at the fireplace and burned the will with the studied calm of a man who had been planning it for years, and she looked at the empty bookshelves and the empty desk and the window that looked out over the backyard where a fig tree her father had planted was still there, still producing, completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the house behind it. She had thought, for a long time, that she would want the house. That when it came back, if it came back, she would feel something definitive about it, something that resolved into a clear decision. Keep it, live in it, reclaim it. Standing in the study, she understood that wasn't what she felt. What she felt was that it was a house her father had lived in and loved and maintained and eventually died in, and that was real and mattered. But it was also a house that held the specific smell and light of the worst night of the last 5 years of her life, and she was not interested in living inside that. She called Patricia Corville from the backyard, standing under the fig tree. "I want to donate it," she said. "The house. To a charitable use. Something that serves people in the area. What's the process?" Patricia, who by this point had stopped being surprised by Nora's decisions and had started simply responding to them efficiently, said she'd look into the options and have something for her by the end of the week. The house became, 6 months later, a transitional housing facility for women exiting domestic violence situations, operated by a nonprofit organization out of Thibodeau that had a 15-year record and a waiting list for appropriate properties. The organization's director, a woman named Sister Marianne who had been doing this work since before Nora was born, walked through the house with a clipboard and said, "This will do very well," and did not elaborate, which Nora found sufficient. The fig tree in the backyard was producing when they moved the first residents in. Sister Marianne said she'd make preserves from it in the fall and give a jar to every resident. Nora thought her father would have liked that specifically. Lily's school did a unit on local history in the spring of her 4th grade year, and her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Fontenot, who had known Robert Calloway from the hardware store and had been one of the people who said it was a shame at the funeral and then gone back to her ordinary life, gave the students an assignment to research a person or family from Portsmouth whose story they thought deserved to be told. Lily came home with the assignment sheet and read it at the kitchen table for 3 minutes. Then she looked up. "Can I write about Grandpa?" "Yes," Nora said. "And the boat? And everything?" "Yes." Lily went back to reading the sheet. "It says we can interview people who knew the person. Can I interview Clarence?" "I think he'd be honored." She interviewed Clarence on a Saturday morning at his shed, with a spiral notebook and a pencil and the particular focused attention she brought to things she decided to take seriously. Clarence answered every question she asked him directly and specifically, and did not condescend and did not simplify, because Lily was 9 years old, and he had long since determined that she found condescension irritating and responded better to being treated like someone old enough to handle the accurate version of things. The interview ran to 14 pages of her notebook. She came home and typed it on Nora's laptop, hunting and pecking with 2 fingers, stopping occasionally to ask how to spell something. The essay took 2 weeks to write in its final form. She got 100 on it. Mrs. Fontenot read sections of it aloud to the class with Lily's permission, and 3 other students asked if they could read the whole thing, and Lily let them, because she had her grandfather's instinct for knowing when sharing something was worth more than keeping it. At the end of the school year, Mrs. Fontenot submitted the essay to a regional youth writing competition. It placed second in the 5th and under category. The judge's comments noted, exceptional narrative clarity for the age and a quality of emotional specificity that is rare in adult writing, let alone in a child's. Lily read the judge's comments and said, "What does specificity mean?" Nora told her. Lily said, "Oh, like when I wrote about the trim ballast." Nora said, "Exactly like that." The Foundation's first major public success came 18 months after incorporation, in a case that had nothing to do with Gerald Marsh or Portsmouth or any of the circumstances that had produced the Foundation itself. A family in Terrebonne Parish named Cheramy had been farming the same land since 1931, a 20-acre property with a small house and a tidal pond that had been in the family across 4 generations. A coastal development company had been running a quiet campaign against them for 2 years, manufactured code violations, pressure on their insurance provider, a legal challenge to a boundary survey that they'd paid to have done correctly, all of it designed to make continuing ownership expensive enough that selling became the only viable option. The Foundation's legal team took the case in its 4th month of operation, referred by a social worker in Homa who had started keeping track of which families she saw with these specific patterns and passing the names along. The case took 11 months to resolve, which was longer than anyone wanted and shorter than it would have been without representation. The development company's manufactured violations were shown to be baseless. The insurance pressure was documented and reported to the state insurance commissioner. The boundary challenge was defeated in court using a survey that the Foundation paid for. The Cheramy family kept their land. Nora went to the resolution hearing, not as a legal participant, but because she'd been following the case since the Foundation took it on and had wanted to see what resolution looked like from the other side of the table. She sat in the public gallery and watched the family, 4 of them, 2 generations, the father in his 60s who had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told he could set it down, and she thought about her father's letter. He'd written, "I want you to take what's yours and don't let anyone talk you out of it." The Cheramys had done exactly that. They needed the Foundation to make it possible, but the doing of it had been theirs, the showing up, the documentation, the willingness to keep fighting past the point where most people would have given in to the manufactured exhaustion of it. She'd seen that willingness before. She recognized it. On the drive back from Terrebonne Parish, she called Simone. "The Cheramy case closed," she said. "I know. Congratulations." "Not to me. To them." She drove with the window cracked, the fall air coming in. "I want to expand the intake capacity. We're turning away cases we should be taking." Simone was quiet for a moment. "That requires another attorney. Probably a paralegal. Office space." "I know. What does that cost?" Simone gave her a number. It was not a large number, relative to what the Foundation had. Nora said, "Do it." And Simone said, "I'll have the job postings up by Monday." The second year of the Foundation was the year Nora stopped thinking of it as her father's legacy and started thinking of it as its own thing, alive in a way that no longer required her to carry it, managed by people who had been doing this work longer than she had and had their own reasons for doing it. She remained on the board. She read the monthly reports. She went to the quarterly meetings and asked the questions that needed asking and trusted the people who knew more than she did to do what they knew how to do. She ran Frayed. Not exclusively, not even primarily, but regularly. Bro kept the account, and 2 other small commercial clients came through referrals from Bro. And by the second year, the Margaret Rose was making 8 to 10 runs a month on Gulf Coast routes that her father had run and some he hadn't, moving cargo for clients who valued reliability and a vessel in good condition over the speed of the larger operators. It was not a large commercial operation. It was not meant to be. It was a working boat doing working things, which was all it had ever been designed for, and Nora found, in those hours on the water, something that nothing else in the last 2 years had quite produced. Clarity. The particular simplicity of being responsible for one thing at a time, of having a destination and a cargo and a route, of knowing what the engine was doing by sound, and what the weather was doing by the feel of the water, and what needed her attention by the information the boat gave her directly, through the hull and the wheel and the instruments, without intermediary. She brought Lily on the weekends when the weather was right and the route was short enough. Lily had learned, by the end of the first year, to read the depth finder and to coil a line correctly, and to tell the difference between the sound of the engine running well and the sound of something slightly off that required attention. She sat in the captain's chair when Nora let her and held the wheel with both hands and watched the water ahead with the expression of a person doing something that felt, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, exactly right. On one of those afternoons, coming back into the Portsmouth Channel in the late light, Lily said, "I want to learn to run this properly when I'm older." Nora said, "We'll start teaching you properly next summer." Lily said, "Clarence said he'd help." Nora said, "Of course he did. Of course he had." Clarence Webb, who had shown up at 8:15 on a January morning with his coffee already made and the decision already taken, who had been on the boat every restoration weekend for 4 months, who had answered Lily's 14 notebook pages of questions with the patience and specificity of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that this particular family was not going to be without an elder who knew things and would say them straight. He had filled, without announcing it, something that had been missing since the funeral, and the careful way he did it present without presuming, available without hovering, was so completely like Robert Calloway in its texture that Nora occasionally caught it in her peripheral vision and had to look again. The town of Portsmouth had done what small towns do with large stories that happen within them, absorbed it slowly, rearranged itself around the new facts, and eventually arrived at a version that emphasized the elements most useful for its sense of itself. The version the town settled on was one in which Robert Calloway had been a quietly exceptional man whose qualities had been recognized all along by those who really knew him, and in which Gerald Marsh had been an outsider from elsewhere, not really of the place, whose manipulation of local systems had been temporary and had met the correction it deserved. This version was not entirely accurate and left out considerably more than it included, but it was the version the town could live in, and Nora did not argue with it because arguing with the town's self-narration was approximately as productive as arguing with the tide. What she did instead, on the October morning of the first anniversary of the salvage resolution, was go to the marina at 6 in the morning before the day got away from her, walk down to slip 14, and sit on the stern deck of the Margaret Rose in the early quiet with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly too cool. The marina was still, a few boats rocking in their slips. A pelican on a piling at the end of the dock, possibly the same pelican, though she knew better than to assume continuity in pelicans. The Gulf moving on the other side of the channel mouth. The smell of brine and diesel and the particular damp sweetness of the marsh in October. She had a freight run at 9. Lily had school. Clarence had someone's outboard to diagnose. The Foundation's case coordinator was presenting the quarterly intake numbers at 11 and needed Nora on the video call. Patricia Corville had sent 3 documents that required signatures and a 4th that required a decision by end of week. The ordinary machinery of a life that had become, over the course of 14 months, recognizably ordinary, full of things to do and people relying on her being where she said she'd be. She sat with the cool coffee and the quiet morning and let all of that sit at a distance for a moment. Her father had run this dock for 30 years. He had stood at this slip, on this deck, in this same early morning light, before runs that were functionally identical to the one she was about to make. He had been here so many times that his weight must have worn a particular line into the wooden dock planking, though she couldn't identify which boards it was. He had done his work and kept his secret and loved his daughter from a careful distance that was not distance at all but protection, and eventually he had trusted her with everything he'd built and let her decide what it was worth. She had decided it was worth every bit of the fight. The Pelican launched from its piling without warning and went out over the channel, banking once on the air, then leveling and disappearing past the channel mouth in the direction of the open Gulf. Gone between one breath and the next, the way the significant things go, not dramatically, just complete. She finished the coffee. She went to start the engine. Some stories end with a verdict or a number or a formal ceremony at which the correct people are present and the correct words are spoken. This one ended. As far as Nora Calloway was concerned, every morning she walked down that dock and put her hand on the line and felt the boat alive under her before she'd even cast off. It ended every time Lily sat in the captain's chair and held the wheel with both hands. It ended every time the Foundation's phone rang and someone on the other end said they'd found the right place to call. And it ended, in the specific way that the best things end, by not ending at all, by becoming simply what was true, What had always been there waiting. What a quiet man had built for the right person and hidden in plain sight until she came home to find it. The engine turned over on the second crank. The diesel settled in. Nora put the boat in gear and took her out of the slip, steady on the helm, nose to the channel, the marsh gold on both sides and the gulf ahead, and the morning entirely her own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.